Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Seen, where curiosity gets cozy and the past sometimes waits for us in the quietest places. Tonight, we are going somewhere unusual. Not into a desert where old stones bake under the sun, not into a buried tomb sealed behind a slab of rock, and not into a museum drawer where a small label tries its very best to explain 5,000 years of human life in 6 polite sentences. Tonight, we are going beneath the surface of the sea into the clear blue water off the southern coast of Greece, where the outline of an ancient town rests only a few meters below the waves. Its name is Pavlopetri, a soft modern name for a place whose ancient name has been lost. And that somehow makes it even more interesting, because this was not a mythic island swallowed by angry gods. It was not a legend invented by sailors after a long evening and perhaps one cup too many of strong wine. Pavlopetri was a real town. People walked there. They carried jars through its streets. They entered rooms, crossed courtyards, stored food, made goods, traded with others, buried their dead nearby, and looked out at the same sea that now covers the stones they left behind. There is something especially strange about an underwater city. A ruin on land feels old, of course. A broken wall on a hillside, a fallen column, a weathered step. These all tell us that time has passed. But a city under the sea feels different. The water moves over it every day. Fish pass through where doorways once stood. Sand gathers where people once placed their feet. Sunlight reaches down in shifting patterns, as though the whole place is being gently read and reread by the sea. It is history, but it is not still. It is ancient, but never completely silent. The waves keep touching it, again and again, like someone checking whether a sleeping child is comfortable. And before we drift too far into this sunken place, I would love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Are you near the sea yourself, perhaps with a window open to the sound of it? Or are you far inland, wrapped in the quieter kind of night, where the only waves are blankets and the occasional heroic effort of a kettle in the kitchen? And if you were standing on a shore right now, looking into clear, shallow water, what do you think would make you lean closer? A glimmer of pottery? A straight line of stones? The faint outline of a street where no street should be? If you find this gentle journey soothing, or if ancient places have a way of settling your thoughts after a long day, I would be ever so grateful if you gave the video a like and perhaps subscribed. It helps this little corner of calm reach other curious night wanderers, including those who enjoy archaeology, the sea, and the comforting idea that even a Bronze Age town can somehow end up with better waterfront property than most of us. So settle in. Let the day loosen its grip a little. Let your thoughts slow down like sand drifting through clear water. Tonight we are visiting Pavlopetri, one of the oldest known submerged towns in the world, a place where streets, buildings, courtyards and tombs have been found beneath the sea off Laconia in southern Greece. The remains lie in shallow water near Punta Beach and the island of Elafonisos, in a place that was once dry land, once useful land, once lived in land. And that is the detail that matters most. Pavlopetri was not built for mystery. It was built for life. Imagine for a moment approaching the coast thousands of years ago, not with diving gear or an underwater camera, but in a small boat, its wood creaking softly, its sail catching the Aegean wind. The water ahead is bright and shallow. The coast is not empty. There are people there. Perhaps smoke rises from cooking fires. Perhaps someone is repairing a net. Perhaps jars are stacked near a building waiting to be moved, filled, traded or stored. The land forms a useful crossing point between the mainland and what is now Elafonisos. In that older landscape, the settlement would have had access to the sea, to fertile ground, to fresh water, and to routes that connected it with other communities around the Aegean. This is one of the first quiet surprises of Pavlopetri. When we hear the words underwater city, the mind tends to jump straight to disaster. One day, a city. The next day, bubbles. But the real story is usually slower, more practical, and in some ways more haunting. Coastlines change, land sinks, sea levels rise, earthquakes shift the ground, storms reshape the shore. A place that once made perfect sense for people can, over long centuries, become a place where only swimmers and archaeologists visit. The sea does not need to be dramatic to win, it has time, and as we learned in another journey, time is very good at getting its way. Pavlopetri sits in the clear waters of Vatica Bay at the southern edge of the Peloponnese, where Greece stretches toward Crete and the wider Mediterranean. Today, if you look down through the water, you can see stone foundations laid out in patterns that are not random. Nature is very talented, but it does not usually arrange stones into streets and rooms just to confuse future researchers. There are lines, corners, spaces that look planned, and the remains of buildings that once formed part of a working town. Some of the ruins are so shallow that a swimmer can hover above them, close enough to see the shapes, yet separated by several thousand years and a thin layer of moving water. It is tempting to call this place a lost city. That phrase has a dramatic ring to it. It suggests treasure maps, secret doors, and perhaps one extremely determined explorer with a hat that has seen better days. But Pavlopetri was not lost to everyone at once. Local people may have known there were stones beneath the water. Fishermen and swimmers may have seen shapes on the seabed long before the site entered modern archaeology. The sea hid the town from ordinary history, yes, but it did not erase it. It simply covered it well enough that the rest of the world took a very long time to pay proper attention. And when attention finally came, it came in stages. In the early 20th century, submerged remains in the area were noted, but the full importance of the place was not yet widely understood. Then, in the 1960s, researchers began to recognise that these were not just scattered stones, or the vague leftovers of an old shoreline. They were looking at the plan of a prehistoric settlement. Streets, buildings, courtyards, tombs, the kind of evidence that makes an archaeologist's pulse quicken in a very professional way, which is to say they probably remain calm on the outside while internally knocking over several imaginary chairs. A team surveyed the remains in 1968, using the methods available at the time, including fixed grids and hand tapes. It was careful work, slow work, the kind that requires patience, clear water, steady hands, and a willingness to spend a long time measuring stones that refuse to move closer just because you are tired. They mapped a town plan lying in shallow water, and then, decades later, the site was studied again with new technology. In the 21st century, underwater archaeology brought in digital tools, sonar, robotic equipment, and three-dimensional recording methods that could capture details far more precisely than earlier teams could manage. This is one of the lovely things about archaeology. It is not only the past that changes as we understand it, the present changes too. A place discovered with hand tapes can later be revisited with digital mapping. A stone foundation that once appeared as a line on paper can become part of a three-dimensional model. Old pottery fragments can be re-examined, new survey areas can be added. The city does not move, but our ability to see it improves. It is a bit like cleaning a pair of spectacles and realizing the world has had individual leaves on trees this entire time. What researchers found at Pavlopetri made the site remarkable. It was not simply an underwater scatter of ruins, it preserved the layout of a town. The remains included building foundations, rooms, courtyards, streets, graves, and chamber tombs. Pottery and other finds showed that the settlement was occupied across different periods, with evidence reaching back into the 3rd and even 4th millennium BC. That makes Pavlopetri extraordinarily old, over 5,000 years old by current archaeological understanding, and often described as the oldest known submerged town with an intact plan. That little phrase, intact plan, is doing a lot of work. It means we are not just guessing at a life from a single object. We can look at the arrangement of a place where life happened. A pot can tell us something, A wall can tell us something, but a town plan tells us about movement. It tells us how people organise space. It hints at where they gathered, where they worked, where they stored goods, where they walked, and how close the living were to the dead. It is the difference between finding one page of a book and finding the table of contents, several chapters, and a shopping receipt tucked inside. Still incomplete, of course, because archaeology is rarely kind enough to hand us the full audiobook version. But it gives structure. It lets us ask better questions. And Pavlopetri invites many questions. Who lived there? What language did they speak? What did they call the place? Did children run through those narrow streets? Did someone complain about the price of fish in exactly the same tone people use now when complaining about the price of absolutely everything? Did traders arrive from Crete, from the Cyclades, from other Aegean ports? Did families store olive oil, grain, or wine in large jars? Did textile workers sit with loom weights nearby, their hands repeating motions learned from parents and grandparents? The stones cannot answer directly, which is rude of them, but they do allow us to listen more carefully. The location of Pavlopetri helps explain why people may have settled there and why it may have become important. A coastal town in the Bronze Age was not just a pretty place to watch sunsets, though I am sure the sunsets were doing their best. It was a practical position. The sea was a road. Boats carried goods, ideas, tools, habits, stories, and probably gossip, because no trade network in human history has ever moved pottery without also moving gossip. Being near the water meant connection. It meant fish, travel, exchange, and contact with other communities. It also meant risk. Storms, changing shorelines, and the slow hunger of the sea were always part of the bargain. When we think of ancient cities, we often imagine grandeur first. Palaces, temples, walls, monuments, impressive staircases that make everyone who climbs them regret their footwear. Pavlopetri offers something slightly different. It gives us the shape of an ordinary town, which may be even more valuable. Not ordinary in the sense of unimportant, but ordinary in the sense of human. Places where people live their daily lives are sometimes harder to preserve than royal buildings or ceremonial sites. They were used, repaired, altered, abandoned, built over, robbed for stone, farmed over, or forgotten. Pavlopetri escaped some of that later disturbance because it went underwater. The sea damaged it in some ways, of course, but it also protected it from ploughs, new construction, and all the usual human improvements that so often involve destroying whatever was there before. There is a strange generosity in that. The same sea that took the town away from daily life also helped keep its layout visible. Pavlopetri became unreachable enough to survive. Not perfectly, not safely, not without threats, but more clearly than many ancient settlements on land. The water covered the streets, and because it did, those streets were not turned into somebody's convenient source of building material. It is hard to steal paving stones when they are underwater. Though humanity being what it is, one should never underestimate our ability to make poor decisions with a snorkel. Even today, the site is vulnerable. Boats, anchors, pollution, tourism, and souvenir hunting can harm remains that have lasted for thousands of years. That is the uncomfortable part of bringing attention to a place like Pavlopetri. To know about it is to value it, but to visit it carelessly is to risk damaging it. Underwater heritage has a special kind of fragility. A wall that seems solid beneath the sea may be only a low arrangement of stones. A careless anchor can do more damage in a moment than centuries of fish politely minding their own business. Preservation here is not only about studying the past, it is about managing the present with enough humility to remember that ancient towns are not props for our holidays. But let us return gently to the town itself, to the idea of it before it sank, before its streets filled with water, before fish moved through its rooms with the calm confidence of creatures who have no interest in Bronze Age zoning. Imagine waking there in the morning. The air is warm, the sea is close. Light enters through openings in walls and doorways. Someone begins work early because ancient life was rarely designed around leisurely lie-ins, which is one of many reasons we should be grateful for modern bedding. A person carries water. Another checks stored goods. Someone tends to a child. Someone prepares food. A craftsperson handles fibre, clay, stone, or metal. The day begins not as history but as routine. That is one of the hardest things to remember about ancient people. They were not trying to be ancient. They were not standing around thinking, I do hope future documentaries discuss our settlement with tasteful background music. They were simply living. Their world was present tense. Their worries were immediate. Weather, food, family, work, trade, health, status, neighbours, repairs. The roof needed attention. The jar cracked. The boat was late. The child had wandered off with something sticky. Life was life, even 5,000 years ago. The distance between us and them is enormous in years, but surprisingly small in habits. And this is why Pavlopetri is so compelling. It does not only tell us that people lived by the sea long ago. We already knew that. It shows us a place arranged for living. A street is not just a line between buildings, it is a record of footsteps. A courtyard is not just an open space. It is where work may have been done, where people may have gathered, where light and air entered domestic life. A tomb is not just evidence of death. It is evidence of care, memory, and community. These ordinary structures are the closest archaeology can sometimes come to hearing voices without sound. The water above Pavlopetri adds another layer to that feeling. On land, ruins sit under the sky and seem to belong to the landscape. Underwater, the town feels suspended between worlds. It is not fully gone because the stones are there. It is not fully reachable because the sea has claimed the space where streets once held air. To look at Pavlopetri is to see two places at once, the living town that was and the submerged site that is. The mind tries to drain the water away, to stand the walls a little higher, to put people back into the rooms, and then the water shifts, sunlight breaks into bright pieces and the present returns. There is no need to turn Pavlopetri into Atlantis to make it interesting. In fact, doing so would make it less interesting. Atlantis belongs to myth, argument, and the sort of television program where every sentence seems to end with a question mark. Pavlopetri belongs to archaeology. It has stones you can map, pottery you can study, graves you can record, and a landscape you can investigate. Its wonder is not that it proves a legend. Its wonder is that it proves something much quieter and more useful. People built a town by the sea more than 5,000 years ago, and the remains of that town are still there, just beneath the water. That quiet reality is enough. More than enough, really. Because once you accept that Pavlopetri was real, the imagination has somewhere firm to stand. You can begin with the facts. Southern Laconia, shallow water, Bronze Age occupation, streets, buildings, courtyards, tombs, later survey, modern mapping. Then you can let the human questions gather around those facts like small boats around a harbour. What did the people eat? How did they trade? How did their houses function? What did the town look like at its busiest? How did it decline? Did people leave slowly, carrying what they could? Or was there a more sudden change? Did they know the sea would keep coming? We must be careful here, because the past does not appreciate being filled in too confidently. It leaves gaps, and those gaps should not be stuffed with whatever sounds dramatic. But careful imagination has its place. It helps us remember that ruins were not always ruins. Pavlopetri was not always a site. It was a settlement, a home, a working place, a coastal community shaped by land and sea. When researchers map its stones, they are not only creating a plan, they are giving form back to a place that time and water had blurred, and perhaps that is why underwater archaeology feels so close to dreaming. A diver descends through clear water, and the modern world softens above. Sound changes, movement slows. The the body becomes aware of breath. Then the seabed appears, and there, among sand and seagrass, are straight lines that should not be there unless hands made them. A wall, a room, a street. Not the towering ruins of a palace, but low stones, patient stones, enough to say someone was here. Not just once, not passing through, but here for generations. There is comfort in that, oddly enough. We live in a world that often feels obsessed with speed, with updates, with newness, with the next thing arriving before the current thing has had time to take its coat off. Pavlopetri asks us to move at a different pace. It has waited thousands of years. It is not in a hurry. It lies beneath a few meters of water while waves pass overhead, and it reminds us that human life has always been temporary, but traces can last in ways no one expects. A town can lose its name and still keep its streets. A wall can lose its roof and still hold a shape. A place can disappear from memory and still be waiting in the shallows. So tonight, as we begin this journey, we will not rush toward the mystery as if it were a locked box to be forced open. We will move slowly through what is known, what is likely, and what remains uncertain. We will look at Pavlopetri as a real settlement before it was a sunken one. We will think about the people who lived along that shore, about Bronze Age trade, about pottery and textiles, about tombs and town planning, about earthquakes, sea level change, rediscovery, digital mapping, and the modern effort to protect what remains. And along the way, we may find that the most extraordinary part of Pavlopetri is not simply that it sank, but that it was once so ordinary. A place of work, a place of family, a place of noise and dust and cooking and footsteps. A place where someone may have stood in a doorway looking at the sea, never imagining that one day the sea would be looking back through that same doorway. The first thing to understand about Pavlopetri is that it does not look like a city in the way our minds usually expect a city to look. There are no towers rising from the water, no temple roof gleaming under the sun, no grand gate waiting for a heroic entrance, no statues standing patiently on the seabed as if posing for the world's slowest photograph. What remains is lower, quieter, and in some ways far more powerful. Stone foundations, lines of walls, the plan of streets, open spaces that once worked as courtyards, tombs close enough to remind us that this was not just a place of trade and shelter, but a place of memory. Today, Pavlopetri lies off the coast of Laconia in the southeastern Peloponnese near Punta Beach and the island of Elafonissos. The water above it is shallow, in places only a few meters deep, which means it is not hidden in some unreachable black trench at the bottom of the sea. It is not waiting beside strange deep-sea creatures with glowing faces and questionable social skills. It is close to shore, close enough that the modern world passes nearby. People swim, boats cross the bay, sunlight reaches the seabed, and beneath all of that ordinary summer brightness rests a town that was already ancient before classical Greece, before the Parthenon, before Socrates asked difficult questions in public places, and long before anyone had to remember where they left their phone charger. The name Pavlopetri is not the ancient name of the town. That older name is lost. Pavlopetri means something like Paul's Stone, connected with the nearby islet and later Christian associations, not with the people who first built and used the settlement thousands of years ago. This is a small detail, but it matters. It reminds us how much of the past arrives without its own label. Archaeologists can map walls, study pottery, date material and reconstruct coastlines, but names can vanish completely. A town can keep its streets and lose its voice. It can keep the shape of its rooms and lose the word its people used when they pointed home. That loss makes Pavlopetri feel both close and distant at the same time. We know where it is. We can describe what has been found there. We can say that it preserves one of the oldest known complete town plans underwater. We can place it in a broad span of human occupation reaching back to the final Neolithic and Bronze Age. Yet we cannot say what its people called it. We cannot introduce it properly in its own language. with the name spoken by traders arriving by boat or children running back from the shore. The modern name is useful, of course. Archaeology does need names, or every report would sound like someone trying to give directions after a very confusing dream. But behind the modern name is an unnamed settlement, and that is the place we are really trying to see. Pavlopetri is often called the oldest submerged town in the world, and that claim is not just based on age alone. There are older submerged places in different parts of the world, and there are ancient sites underwater that tell us about early human life by former coastlines. What makes Pavlopetri so special is the preservation of an organised town plan. It is not just a scatter of tools or a few isolated structures. It includes streets, buildings, courtyards, graves, and rock-cut tombs. That gives researchers something rare, a way to study how a prehistoric coastal community was arranged across space. The town is not complete in the sense that the walls stand high and the roofs remain. The roofs, I am afraid, did not politely wait 5,000 years for us. But the ground plan is there, and in archaeology, a ground plan can be a very generous thing. A single object can tell a story, but a town plan tells a different kind of story. A pot may tell us about food, storage, trade, or taste. A blade may tell us about tools and work. A grave may tell us about burial customs and belief. But a street tells us about movement. A courtyard tells us about shared space. A doorway tells us about entry and privacy. A cluster of rooms tells us that people organised activities, separated tasks, and shaped their daily lives through architecture. Pavlopetri gives us not just things, but relationships between things. It lets us ask how people moved through the settlement, how close the living spaces were to burial areas, how buildings were grouped, and how the town may have developed as its role changed. And because it is underwater, the town carries another unusual advantage. Many ancient settlements on land have been disturbed again and again. Later people built over them, quarried stone from them, farmed across them, dug into them, flattened them, or turned them into something else entirely. Humans are very practical creatures, especially when presented with a handy pile of old stones. Pavlopetri avoided some of that later disturbance because the sea covered it. The same process that removed it from ordinary life also helped preserve the layout. The water did not leave it untouched. Currents, sediment, erosion, anchors and storms have all had their say. But the site was not turned into a modern town, a road, a field, or a convenient extension for somebody's cousin. There is a quiet irony in that. The sea is both the reason the town became hidden and one of the reasons it survived in a recognisable form. It took the streets out of use, but it also protected their arrangement. It made the city harder to live in, which, to be fair, is one of the sea's more convincing arguments, but it also made the city harder to destroy in the usual ways. So when divers and archaeologists began to study the site, they were not simply finding ruins, they were finding a preserved pattern of human planning, a prehistoric map written in stone beneath the water. The location was no accident. Pavlopetri sat in a useful place, in the channel between the mainland Peloponnese and what is now the island of Elafonisos. In the past, that landscape was different. The island and mainland were connected by an isthmus, and the coast provided access to fertile land, fresh water, and sheltered sea routes. For people in the Bronze Age, this would have been a sensible place to live. A coastal settlement could fish, travel, trade, and keep contact with other communities. The sea was not just scenery. It was road, pantry, workplace, and message carrier all at once. A modern person might stand by the shore and think, "What a beautiful view." A Bronze Age person may have thought that too, but also, can a boat land here safely? Is there fresh water nearby? Is the soil useful? Can we see who is coming? Can we move goods from here to there without everyone falling over rocks and complaining? Beauty is welcome, of course, but ancient settlement choices often had the good manners to be practical. Pavlopetri's position offered practical advantages. It sat near routes across the Aegean world. It had access to land and sea resources. It was placed in a region where maritime contact could matter enormously. This is where the town begins to feel less like a lonely ruin and more like a working coastal centre. During the Bronze Age, the Aegean was full of movement. Boats carried pottery, raw materials, finished goods, foodstuffs, ideas, and people. Communities were not sealed away in little bubbles of local life. They were connected, sometimes loosely, sometimes strongly, by trade and travel. Pavlopetri appears to have been part of that wider world. Pottery found at the site, including storage jars and transport containers, points to exchange and contact. Some evidence connects the settlement with Crete, the Cyclades, and other parts of the Aegean. This does not mean every person in Pavlopetri was constantly discussing international maritime networks over breakfast, though one never knows. Some households are very intense before breakfast. It means the town belonged to a world of movement. To picture Pavlopetri properly, we should not imagine a silent place made only of stone. We should imagine noise, not modern traffic noise, of course. No engines, no scooters, no one reversing a delivery van while it beeps as if announcing the end of civilization. But there would have been human sound. Footsteps on packed surfaces, voices calling between buildings, the scrape of pottery, the thud of work. Animals, children, boats being handled at the shore, wind, water, tools, the kind of ordinary noise that tells you a place is alive. The town would also have had smells, which history books often leave out, perhaps wisely. The sea, smoke, stored food, damp earth, animals, clay, fish, oil, fibres being worked, human bodies in warm weather. Ancient life was not arranged for museum freshness. It was physical, practical, and very close to the materials that sustained it. When we look at a clean plan of Pavlopetri, with neat lines and labelled buildings, it can seem calm and tidy. But the living town would have been busy, dusty, salty, and full of things that needed doing. Archaeologists identified at least 15 buildings in the early survey, with some structures having multiple rooms. Later work expanded the known area and showed that the settlement was larger and more complex than earlier mapping had captured. The recorded remains include building foundations, streets, courtyards, tombs, and graves. That combination matters because it suggests a developed community, not a temporary camp. People were not merely stopping there for a few days because the weather had turned awkward. They built. They organised. They buried their dead. They returned to the same spaces. They made the settlement part of their lives across generations. The presence of tombs close to the settlement adds weight to the place. Death was not pushed far out of view in the way many modern towns arrange cemeteries beyond busy streets and signposts. In many ancient communities, burial spaces formed part of the lived landscape. At Pavlopetri, chamber tombs and cyst graves were identified, showing that the area held not only houses and movement routes, but also formal care for the dead. A cyst grave is usually a small stone-built burial box or lined grave. A chamber tomb is larger, cut or built to receive burials. These are not just technical categories. They are traces of decisions made by living people. Someone prepared the space. Someone placed the body. Someone remembered where the grave was. That closeness between daily life and burial can feel strange from a modern perspective, but it tells us something important. A town is not only where people eat and work, it is where they belong. Burial anchors people to place. It says, in the most concrete way possible, our people are here. At Pavlopetri, the living and the dead shared the same coastal world. The settlement was not only a useful stop on a trade route, it was a community with memory built into its landscape. When researchers describe Pavlopetri as an urban centre, it is worth hearing that phrase carefully. It does not mean a city like Athens or Rome. It does not mean tall apartment blocks, civic squares, or someone arguing about parking. It means a settlement with organised planning, specialised activities, and regional importance for its time. In the context of the Bronze Age Aegean, A town like Pavlopetri could be significant without looking monumental by later standards. Its importance may have rested in trade, production, location and connection, rather than in grand buildings designed to intimidate visitors. One of the more intriguing possibilities is that Pavlopetri played a role in textile production. Archaeologists have found many loom weights at the site. Loom weights are small but telling objects. They were used to hold threads under tension on a loom, making them part of the equipment needed for weaving. Textiles rarely survive well in the archaeological record, especially after thousands of years and a long holiday underwater. Cloth rots, fibres disappear. The finished product is often gone. But loom weights remain, quietly announcing that weaving took place. They are the ancient equivalent of walking into a room, seeing flour on the counter, and reasonably concluding that someone has been baking, or at least made a brave attempt. Textile production was not a minor domestic footnote in the ancient world. Cloth was essential. Clothing, sails, bags, coverings, trade goods, household items. Making textiles required skill, labour and time. If Pavlopetri produced textiles at a meaningful scale, that would fit with its identity as a connected coastal settlement. Goods made there could have been used locally or exchanged more widely. A port town does not need to produce everything, but what it does produce can help define its role. The pottery also speaks of storage and movement. Large pithoi, or storage jars, suggest goods kept in quantity. Transport containers suggest things moving in and out. Pottery fragments may not look dramatic at first glance, but they are among archaeology's most useful witnesses. They preserve styles, fabrics, shapes, and manufacturing choices. They can connect one region to another. They can show whether a community made its own versions of foreign shapes, imported vessels directly, or adopted habits from other places. A broken pot is rarely just a broken pot. It is a piece of a larger economic and cultural conversation. Admittedly, it is a conversation where one side is silent and the other side is assured, but archaeology has always been good at making the best of difficult interviews. The more we look at Pavlopetri, the more it becomes a place defined by connection. Connected to the mainland, connected to Elafonissos, connected to the sea, connected to the Bronze Age networks of the Aegean, connected to the dead through its tombs, connected to us now through the strange survival of its plan. This is not connection in a vague sense. It is visible in location, layout, material finds, and the effort required to study the site. Everything about Pavlopetri asks us to think across boundaries, land and sea, past and present, daily life and long-term change. The site also challenges the way we imagine old age in human history. 5,000 years sounds impossibly distant. It is easy to flatten that distance into a single phrase, as if all prehistoric people lived in one large foggy room labelled long ago. But Pavlopetri was not a vague beginning. It had phases. It changed over time. It was occupied across different periods, with evidence from early occupation and later Bronze Age activity. A settlement that lasts across centuries is not one thing. It develops, adapts, expands, contracts, repairs itself, and responds to changes in trade, environment, and society. What we see underwater is a compressed version of a long story. That is why the phrase, oldest hidden town, should not make us think of a place frozen on one single day. Pavlopetri was not a photograph. It was a process. A small community may have grown into something more complex. Houses may have been rebuilt. Streets may have shifted. Activities may have changed. The town's role may have strengthened as maritime exchange grew, then weakened when wider systems began to break down. By the end of the Bronze Age, many parts of the Eastern Mediterranean went through serious disruption. Palaces collapsed. Trade networks changed. Populations moved, political systems altered. Pavlopetri's decline likely belongs somewhere in that wider story, though the exact reasons are still debated. Still, before we think too much about decline, it is worth letting the town stand at its height for a while. Imagine arriving there when it was active. A boat approaches from the sea. The water is shallow enough to show changes in colour where sand, rock and weed lie below. The settlement sits low near the shore, built for use rather than display. People notice the boat. Perhaps they know it. Perhaps they are waiting for goods. Perhaps they are suspicious, because a healthy amount of suspicion is useful whenever strangers arrive by sea with cargo and opinions. The boat brings pottery, news, maybe raw materials, maybe people from another island or coast. Goods move from shore to storage. Someone counts, someone argues, someone lifts something heavy and immediately regrets having stood closest to it. Inside the town, daily tasks continue. Food is prepared, fibres are spun or woven, vessels are repaired or reused. Children learn the geography of their own streets by running through them. Older people remember where buildings used to be different. A family passes near a burial place and knows who is there. The sea remains constant but not passive. It offers food and movement but also weather and danger. The town lives with that balance every day. What makes this scene compelling is not that it is exotic, it is that it is recognisable. The materials are different, the technologies are different, the language is lost, but the structure of life is familiar. People needed food, shelter, work, relationships, safety and meaning. They made places to support those needs. Pavlopetri is one of those places, and because of its preservation underwater, we can still trace its outline. There is a habit in popular history of searching for the spectacular. The largest pyramid, the richest tomb, the most mysterious inscription, the battle that changed everything. These are important, of course, and sometimes very entertaining, especially when the mysterious inscription turns out to be a tax record, as history enjoys keeping us humble. But Pavlopetri's importance is quieter. It is a town plan. It is evidence of ordinary organisation. It gives scholars a rare view of a prehistoric coastal settlement, not through one monument, but through the arrangement of everyday space. That everyday quality is exactly why it deserves attention. The people of Pavlopetri were not footnotes to later Greek history. They lived in their own present, with their own habits, priorities and problems. They did not know they were early. They did not know they would become useful evidence. They were not waiting to be discovered. They were making a life by the sea, and the sea, slowly or suddenly or in stages, changed the terms of that life. The modern discovery and study of Pavlopetri also remind us that the past is not always hidden deep underground. Sometimes it is visible in plain sight, if you know how to look. The ruins were first noted in the early 20th century, but their wider importance became clearer after Nicholas Fleming recognised the submerged remains in 1967, and a Cambridge team mapped them in 1968. That first survey used hand tapes and a fixed grid, practical tools for a difficult environment. It produced a plan that showed a prehistoric town lying under shallow water. Decades later, newer projects returned with advanced methods, including digital underwater survey, sonar, photogrammetry, and three-dimensional recording. The town stayed where it was. Our ability to see it changed. This is a pleasing thought before sleep in its own way. Not everything unknown is beyond reach. Sometimes the missing piece is not the place itself, but the method. A town can wait beneath 3 or 4 meters of water for thousands of years. One generation notices stones, another maps them with tapes, another scans and models them in 3 dimensions. Knowledge arrives in layers, like sediment in reverse. Slowly, carefully, the outline becomes clearer. Pavlopetri's shallowness gives the site an unusual intimacy. Deep underwater archaeology often depends on expensive equipment, remotely operated vehicles, and conditions that feel more like space exploration than field work. Pavlopetri, by contrast, lies close enough for divers and even swimmers to understand its setting directly. That does not make the work easy. Underwater recording is demanding even in shallow water. Visibility changes, waves interfere. Measurements are awkward. You cannot simply put down a notebook, sharpen a pencil and lean comfortably on a wall, because the wall is underwater and your pencil is having a crisis. But the site's closeness to the surface helps us imagine it. It is not a lost world beyond all human scale. It is right there, under moving light. That closeness also makes its protection urgent. A site in shallow water is easier to study, but also easier to damage. Anchors can drag across stones. Visitors can remove small finds. Sediment can be stirred. Boats can pass. Pollution can affect the surrounding environment. Pavlopetri has lasted for millennia, but survival over deep time does not mean immunity in the present. Ancient sites can be very old and very fragile at the same time, rather like certain family teacups that everyone insists are priceless, while still putting them on a crowded table. So when we call Pavlopetri hidden, we should not imagine that hidden means safe. Hidden can preserve, but attention can protect too if handled carefully. The more people understand that this is not just a pretty patch of stones beneath clear water, the more likely it is that the site will be treated as heritage rather than scenery. Underwater cultural heritage asks for a slightly different kind of respect. You cannot rope it off like a museum display. You cannot place it behind glass. You have to manage a living environment where sea, tourism, fishing, boating, research and local life all meet. And perhaps that is fitting because Pavlopetri has always been about meeting points. It sat where land met sea. It connected local life with wider trade. It held houses near graves, work near water, daily routine near long-distance movement. Even now it sits between scholarship and public imagination, between science and wonder, between a holiday coastline and one of the most important submerged prehistoric sites known. The oldest hidden town under the sea is not asking us to believe in fantasy. It is asking us to pay attention to the ordinary facts, because the ordinary facts are already astonishing. There was a settlement here more than 5,000 years ago. It had streets, it had buildings, it had courtyards, it had tombs. It had a role in the life of the Aegean. Its people lived by the sea, used the sea, depended on it, and eventually lost their town to the changing coast. The stones remain, low and quiet, still arranged in the pattern of human use. And once that pattern becomes visible, it is difficult not to place people back into it. Not as legends, not as shadows. As workers, parents, traders, mourners, neighbours, craftspeople, and children. The town beneath the waves becomes less of a mystery object, and more of a place where mornings began, where tasks repeated, where boats arrived, and where someone, thousands of years ago, may have paused at the edge of the shore and looked out across the water, thinking about weather, work, family, or dinner, because even in the Bronze Age, dinner had a way of becoming important. From here, the stones start to lead us toward the lives that once filled them. The streets are useful, but streets make more sense when we imagine footsteps. The buildings are useful, but buildings make more sense when we imagine what happened inside them. The pottery, the loom weights, the tombs, the storage jars and the shoreline all begin to point toward a community that was not only ancient, but active, practical, and deeply tied to the sea beside it. Before the water came, before the streets became channels for fish, and the courtyards became patches of sand and seagrass, Pavlopetri was simply a place where people lived by the shore. That may sound almost too simple, but it is the most important thing to hold on to. Long before anyone called it a submerged city, long before divers traced its walls beneath the sea, long before researchers brought sonar equipment and careful measuring grids into the clear water, it was not a mystery. It was home. The people who lived there would have known the coast not as a scenic view, but as part of the working fabric of each day. The sea was close enough to smell. It would have shaped the air, the food, the trade, the risks, and the rhythm of life. In the morning, light would have moved across the settlement from the waterside first, catching on roofs, walls, jars, tools, baskets, and the faces of people already beginning their tasks. A coastal town does not wake all at once. It stirs in pieces. Someone tends a fire. Someone checks a storage jar. Someone walks toward the shore. Someone calls to a child who's already too close to something breakable. Human life, even in the Bronze Age, had its little negotiations before breakfast. Pavlopetri stood in a useful coastal position in southern Laconia, near the place where the mainland faces Elafonisos. Today that relationship is separated by water, but in the deeper past the land and coastline were arranged differently. This matters because ancient settlements were not placed randomly. People did not usually choose a location just because it looked pleasant at sunset, though the sunsets along that coast were probably doing excellent work. They chose places that could support life. A settlement needed fresh water, workable land, access to food, safety, routes of movement, and materials for building and work. Pavlopetri had the advantages of the shore and the advantages of connection. To live there was to live with the sea as a neighbour, not a quiet neighbour exactly. The sea is generous, but it is not polite. It brings fish, roots, salt air, and contact with other communities. It also brings storms, dampness, erosion, and the occasional reminder that boats are only useful when they remain the correct way up. The people of Pavlopetri would have understood this balance. They were not romantic about the sea in the modern holiday sense. They depended on it, worked with it, watched it, feared it when they needed to, and used it when they could. The shoreline would have been one of the busiest parts of the settlement's world. Boats arriving or leaving would have meant work. Goods had to be carried, counted, stored, repaired, traded, or repacked. A boat might bring pottery from another region, raw materials, foodstuffs, news, or visitors. It might leave with local products, perhaps textiles, perhaps stored goods, perhaps cargo packed in ceramic containers. The shore was not just an edge. It was a doorway. People, objects, and information moved through it. It helps to imagine Pavlopetri not as a dramatic city of palaces and towers, but as a practical coastal town made of repeated actions. Someone lifting a jar, someone grinding grain, someone mending a net or rope, someone preparing fibres, someone watching weather over the water, someone sweeping a packed floor, someone carrying food from one room to another. The ancient world was full of skill, but much of that skill was domestic, repetitive, and easy for us to overlook because it did not always leave large monuments behind. A town survives in stone, but a life is made from gestures. The buildings at Pavlopetri were arranged with streets and open spaces, and that layout tells us something about ordinary movement. A street is not only a route, it is a shared habit. People used it so often that it became part of the town's logic. The same turns, the same entries, the same courtyards, the same path from home to shore or from storage area to working space. A child growing up there would have learned the settlement through the feet, before understanding it in the mind. This wall means home. That turn leads to the neighbour. That open area is where work happens. That path goes down toward the boats. That place is where the elders say not to run, which of course means children ran there whenever possible. The houses themselves were probably not grand in the later Greek or Roman sense. We should not picture marble halls or painted columns. Pavlopetri belongs to a much earlier world. Its buildings were working structures, with stone foundations and rooms used for domestic and practical purposes. Some may have held storage. Some may have been places for food preparation, craft, sleeping, or family life. Roofs and upper materials are gone, but the foundations show that people organised space carefully. They divided interiors, they made courtyards, they set boundaries between private rooms, shared work areas, and movement routes. A courtyard in such a settlement could be very important. It gave light, air, and space for work that was awkward indoors. In a warm climate, much daily activity could spill outside. Food preparation, sorting, repairs, craft work, conversations, childcare, and small domestic tasks may have taken place in these open spaces. A courtyard is easy to underestimate when looking at a flat plan. On a map, it is only an empty shape. In life, it may have been one of the busiest places in the household. Empty space is not always unused space. Often it is where life gathers. Storage would have mattered deeply. In a modern kitchen, a person may complain about having no cupboard space while standing beside a refrigerator, 3 shelves, and a drawer full of mysterious cables that have somehow migrated from another room. In a Bronze Age town, storage was not a minor convenience. It was survival, trade, and household management. Large ceramic jars, or pithoi, could hold food, liquids, or goods kept in quantity. Smaller vessels served cooking, serving, pouring, and transport. Pottery was part of the daily machinery of life. It held the harvest, carried goods, preserved supplies, and made trade possible. When archaeologists find many pottery fragments at Pavlopetri, those fragments are doing quiet but important work. They help show the age of the settlement. They show connections to other places. They show what kinds of vessels were used. They suggest how goods moved. Pottery is one of archaeology's most loyal witnesses, partly because people broke so much of it. This is comforting in a way. Every time a modern person drops a mug and feels clumsy, they are participating in a very long human tradition. The difference is that a Bronze Age broken vessel may eventually become valuable evidence, while the modern mug usually becomes a small domestic tragedy and a reason to fetch a broom. Food would have shaped the day at Pavlopetri. People living along the shore likely used both land and sea resources. Fish and shellfish may have been part of the diet, along with grains, olives, pulses, fruits, and animal products available in the region. The precise mix would have depended on season, access, status, trade, and household choices. Cooking required fuel, vessels, water, time, and labour. Meals did not appear with the soft ding of a microwave. Food had to be grown, gathered, stored, processed, cooked, shared, and cleaned up after. Even in the Bronze Age, washing up must have followed human civilization around like a very persistent shadow. Grain was not just food. It was time stored in edible form. Someone had to sow, tend, harvest, thresh, grind, and cook it. Grinding grain by hand was hard labour. It was repetitive and physical, and it was likely a regular part of domestic work. The sound of grinding stones may have been as ordinary in a settlement like Pavlopetri as the hum of a refrigerator is in a modern home. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, just necessary. The kind of sound that means life is continuing. Textile production may also have been a major part of life in Pavlopetri. Many loom weights have been found at the site, and loom weights are clear evidence for weaving activity. This detail opens an entire room in the imagination. Textile work is easy to miss because cloth rarely survives for thousands of years, especially in wet conditions. But in ancient economies, textiles were extremely important. Clothes, blankets, bags, coverings, sails, straps, and trade goods all depended on fibre production and weaving. A community that produced textiles was making something valuable, useful, and labour-intensive. The process began long before the loom. Fibre had to be obtained, cleaned, prepared, spun, and then woven. Each stage required skill. Thread does not simply become cloth because someone gives it encouragement. It must be controlled, tensioned, crossed, packed, and finished. Loom weights helped hold the vertical threads tight on a warp-weighted loom. The person working at the loom had to understand rhythm, tension, pattern, and material. Weaving was not passive work. It was skilled production, and if Pavlopetri had a thriving textile activity, then some of its people may have spent long hours in this kind of careful labour. Picture a room or courtyard where loom weights hang from threads, where fibres are sorted, where hands repeat a task learned through practice rather than written instruction. Perhaps several people work near one another. Perhaps older family members teach younger ones. Perhaps the work is domestic, or perhaps it is organised at a larger scale for exchange. The sound would be soft but steady. Fibre moving through fingers, weights shifting, a tool tapping, voices nearby. A craft like this connects body, memory and economy. It is household work, but it can also be trade. trade gives Pavlopetri a wider horizon. The town's position and finds suggest that it was not isolated. Large storage jars and transport containers point toward exchange within Bronze Age networks. Evidence from pottery indicates connections with places such as Crete, the Cyclades, and other Aegean regions. This does not mean every household was wealthy, or that ships arrived daily in a grand parade of international commerce. It means Pavlopetri took part in a world where coastal communities communicated by sea. Goods and styles moved. People recognized forms made elsewhere. Local choices were shaped by distant contacts. The Bronze Age Aegean was a world of islands, coasts, harbours and sea lanes. Boats were the links. They were also risks. A journey by sea depended on weather, seasons, skill and luck. A trader leaving Pavlopetri might know the route and still respect it. The sea has never cared how experienced anyone is. It can be calm in the morning and unreasonable by afternoon, yet the rewards of maritime exchange were real. A coastal town could gain materials, prestige goods, information, and relationships that inland communities might access more slowly. Pavlopetri's harbour-like setting made it part of this moving world. Metal tools, stone blades, pottery styles, food products, textiles, pigments, and other materials could travel through such networks. Even ideas travelled. Techniques, designs, habits, burial customs, building choices, and ways of organising work could spread through contact. A boat does not carry only cargo. It carries stories. It carries news of other settlements, marriages, deaths, shortages, conflicts, opportunities, and probably complaints about the last place it visited. The Aegean may have looked like water between communities, but in practice it often worked as the road between them. Family life would have been central to Pavlopetri. Archaeology does not always make family visible, especially when names and written records are absent, but a town plan makes no sense without households. People slept, cooked, stored, argued, repaired, cared, taught, and aged within these spaces. Children would have grown up surrounded by work. They would have watched adults use tools, prepare food, handle animals, manage storage, and interact with traders or neighbours. Childhood in such a place was probably less separated from adult work than it often is today. A child did not need a school trip to learn how a household functioned. The household was the school trip every day, with fewer permission forms. The elderly, too, would have held knowledge that mattered. In a community without printed manuals or helpful online videos titled "How to Repair a Bronze Age Roof in 10 Simple Steps," experience was extremely valuable. Older people knew weather patterns, family histories, routes, techniques, boundaries, debts, agreements, and stories. They knew which storage jar had a crack, which neighbour could be trusted with a borrowed tool, and which stretch of shore was best avoided when the wind came from a certain direction. Practical memory held a community together. Status differences may have existed as well. The presence of different types of burials around Pavlopetri suggests social distinctions, though we should be cautious about reading too much from limited evidence. Some people may have had more goods, larger houses, greater influence, or stronger trade connections. In any town, even a small one, not every household is the same. Some people command more labour, some control storage, some specialise in exchange. Some are remembered differently in death. The arrangement of tombs and burial practices gives hints of how the community marked identity and status, but not enough to turn individuals into clear portraits. The dead were part of the landscape. Chamber tombs and cist graves have been recorded near the settlement, showing that burial was formal and meaningful. A grave is never merely a hole in the ground. It is an action taken by the living. It requires time, effort, and choice. It may involve objects, position, ritual, memory, and repeated visits. To bury someone near the town is to keep them within the social world of the living, even after death. The people of Pavlopetri did not only build for shelter and trade. They also made places for the dead, and those places tell us that belonging continued beyond daily work. Imagine a funeral there, not with modern ceremony, but with whatever customs the community knew. People gather. A body is prepared. Objects may be placed nearby. Words are spoken, or perhaps silence is kept. Children watch from behind adults. Someone remembers the person as young. Someone thinks of unfinished work. Someone worries about the household left behind. The sea is still there, moving as it always moves, indifferent and constant. The burial becomes part of the town's memory. Later, people pass near that place and know who lies there, at least for a while. Eventually names fade, then generations fade, then the town itself fades. But the grave remains. This is the kind of detail that turns Pavlopetri from a site into a community. It had productive life, trade life, domestic life, and ritual life. It had people making goods and people mourning losses. It had children learning paths and adults managing risks. It had hands working at looms and hands lifting jars. It had the small tensions of neighbours living close together. Ancient towns were not peaceful simply because they were old. Someone was always annoyed about something. A missing tool, a late boat, a loud animal, a cracked pot, a relative who had opinions about how things should be done. Human history would be much shorter if everyone had always got along. The climate and environment would have shaped buildings and habits. In warm Mediterranean conditions, shade mattered. Ventilation mattered. Access to water mattered. Work could move between indoor rooms and open courtyards depending on the season and the task. The sea moderated the air but also brought dampness and salt. Materials had to be maintained. Wood rotted, roofs needed repair, clay cracked, stone endured, which is why stone foundations are what we mostly see today. But the ancient town would have included many perishable materials now gone. Wood, reeds, textiles, leather, baskets and food remains would have made the place feel much richer and more textured than the surviving ruins suggest. Colour is another thing we often lose. The underwater stones now seem pale, grey, brown, and softened by the sea. But the living town would have had colour from pottery, cloth, food, fires, plants, animals, skin, hair, tools, and the bright movement of the coast. A settlement is not only its architecture, it is all the temporary things that pass through it. Laundry drying, fish laid out, clay vessels with different surfaces, woven material, painted or decorated ceramics, sunlight on wet boat timber, smoke rising against morning light. These things do not preserve well, but they were part of what people actually saw. The day's schedule would not have been ruled by clocks. Time was measured by light, weather, tasks, season, and need. People knew morning by the sun, not by an alarm that sounds like a tiny machine having a panic attack. Work followed practical rhythms. Boats left when conditions allowed. Food preparation followed household needs. Agricultural labour followed seasons. Craft production followed demand, available materials and labour. Night changed the settlement. Without electric light, darkness mattered. Fires, lamps, moonlight, and stars shaped what could be done. The same streets that felt familiar by day may have felt different at night. The sky would have been part of life too. Not in a dramatic, mystical way every hour of the day, but as a practical guide. Weather could be read in clouds, wind, pressure, and sea surface. Seasonal shifts mattered for sailing, planting, harvesting, and storage. People living by the shore had to be attentive. The coast rewards attention and punishes carelessness. A change in wind could alter plans. A storm could damage boats or buildings. A poor season could affect food supplies. Pavlopetri's people lived in a world where nature was not background. It was active company. There may have been animals in and around the settlement. Dogs, goats, sheep, cattle, donkeys, or pigs may have formed part of the broader domestic world, depending on local conditions and period. Animals provided food, fibre, labour, protection, and problems. Anyone who has lived near goats will understand that animals are not passive economic units. They are mobile opinions. They get into things. They make noise. They require care. Their presence would have added sound, smell, and movement to the town. Crafts beyond weaving were likely part of daily activity. Pottery use was everywhere, though not necessarily all pottery was made on site. Stone tools, repairs, food processing, basketry, rope making, and other household crafts may have been common. Much work happened in materials that do not survive clearly. This creates a bias in what we can see. Stone and pottery speak loudly because they last. Wood, fibre, leather, and food remain quieter because they disappear. The ancient town was not made only of the durable things we recover. It was made equally of the fragile things that vanished. That is why daily life before the water came must be imagined carefully, using evidence without pretending to know every detail. We can say there were buildings, streets, courtyards, tombs, pottery, storage jars, transport vessels, loom weights, and signs of Aegean contact. From that, we can reasonably build a picture of a coastal Bronze Age community involved in domestic production, storage, trade, and local life. We cannot give names to individuals. We cannot describe a particular family with certainty. We cannot say exactly what someone ate on a given Tuesday. Though if archaeology ever reaches that level, historians will become entirely unbearable at dinner parties. What we can do is restore the settlement's ordinariness. Pavlopetri was not waiting to become a ruin. It was not a symbol. It was not a warning. It was a functioning place. People rose in the morning and did what needed doing. They repaired, cooked, traded, stored, wove, carried, sailed, mourned, and slept. They made decisions based on weather, supplies, relationships, and opportunity. They were shaped by the sea but not defined only by it. The sea was one part of a larger life. And then, slowly across time, the conditions that made the place useful changed. Coastlines are not fixed, land can sink, sea levels can rise, earthquakes can alter the relationship between land and water, storms can cut into the shore. What had once been a good place to build can become exposed, damp, threatened, or unusable. The people of Pavlopetri may have noticed changes gradually. A familiar path flooding more often, a low area becoming harder to use, salt water reaching places it had not reached before, a storm leaving damage that could be repaired once, then again, then perhaps not worth repairing. Environmental change is often not a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it is a series of small defeats. Still, before that happened, the town had a long human life. Its people stood on dry ground. They used streets that are now underwater. They opened doors where fish now pass. They stored goods where sand now gathers. They worked in courtyards where sunlight now trembles through clear water. To picture Pavlopetri before the water came is to drain the sea away for a moment and put the weight of ordinary life back onto the stones. Person walks from a room into a courtyard, carrying a vessel. Another sits near a loom, checking the tension of threads. Near the shore, a boat is being prepared. Someone lifts a storage jar with assistance, because sensible people do not lift large storage jars alone, unless they enjoy regret. A child watches a stranger arrive with goods from elsewhere. An older person recognises the style of a pot and says something about another island, another coast, another time. Smoke rises, animals move, the day warms. The sea waits nearby, blue and useful, not yet inside the town. That is the Pavlopetri we need to remember. Not only the submerged plain, but the living settlement beneath it. Not only an archaeological site, but a town of hands and habits. Its stones beneath the water are the final outline of a much fuller world. And as those daily details settle into view, the next thing to notice is the shape of the town itself, the way its streets, courtyards, tombs and rooms were arranged, because the layout is one of the reasons Pavlopetri matters so much, and it is where the hidden city begins to reveal how carefully its people made a home by the sea, Now that we have imagined Pavlopetri as a living town, with food being prepared, jars being carried, cloth being woven, and boats arriving from the blue edge of the Aegean, we can begin to look more closely at the shape of the place itself. Because the shape is one of the reasons Pavlopetri matters so much. It is not only old. It is not only underwater, it is organised, and that organisation gives us something rare, a chance to study the layout of a prehistoric coastal town rather than just a few scattered objects from one. When people first hear about an underwater city, they often picture something grand and dramatic. Tall walls, stone arches, columns standing in the water like proud old actors who missed their final cue. Pavlopetri is quieter than that. Most of its remains are low on the seabed. The walls do not rise high. There are no complete houses with roofs and doorways still standing. The town has been reduced to its ground plan, its foundations, its lines, its spaces. But that is exactly what makes it so useful. A ground plan is like the footprint of a life. It tells us where people moved, where they stopped, where they separated one activity from another, and where they made room for the dead beside the living. Look down through the shallow water today, and the first thing that might catch your eye is not a single impressive monument, but a pattern. Straight edges, corners, stones arranged in lines that nature would be unlikely to make by accident. The seabed has plenty of natural shapes, of course. Rocks crack, sand shifts, seagrass grows in patches, but human building has a certain habit of repeating angles and boundaries. A wall meets another wall, a room opens toward another space, a street runs between buildings. The eye begins to notice order, and once it notices, the town starts to appear. The early survey of Pavlopetri in the late 1960s recorded a prehistoric town plan covering roughly 300 metres by 150 metres, lying in shallow water between the Panta coast and the small island of Pavlopetri. At least 15 separate buildings were identified, along with courtyards, streets, 2-chamber tombs, and at least 37 cist graves. Later research expanded what was known, showing that the settlement was larger and more complex than the first plan suggested. But even that early work was enough to show that this was not a random group of ruins. It was a town with a layout. That may sound obvious, but it is a big step in archaeology. A pile of ancient stones can be interesting. A group of walls can be interesting. But a town plan lets researchers ask much better questions. Where were the streets? How did buildings relate to one another? Were open spaces private or shared? Were tombs placed inside, beside, or outside the main activity areas? Did certain buildings seem larger or more important? Was the settlement planned all at once, or did it grow in stages? These questions are not only about architecture, they're about behaviour. A street, for example, is a very ordinary thing until you stop and think about what it means. A street is repeated movement made visible. It tells us that people walk the same route often enough for that route to matter. It may connect houses to the shore, houses to working areas, houses to burial areas, or one neighbourhood to another. In Pavlopetri, streets help us imagine the rhythm of daily life. A person carrying a jar would choose the easiest route. A child would know which turn led home. A visitor arriving from the shore would follow the paths between buildings. Streets are not only empty strips between walls, they are the places where a town meets itself. And because Pavlopetri is underwater, those streets have an especially strange presence. They are no longer walked, but they are still legible. Fish pass along them without any concern for Bronze Age traffic patterns. Sand has settled where feet once fell. Water moves through spaces that once held dry air. It is easy to look at a submerged street and think only about loss, but there is another side to it. The street remains visible because later buildings did not cover it, later farmers did not plough through it, and later people did not steal every useful stone from it. The sea changed the town, but it also preserved the town's arrangement. The buildings themselves were made of multiple rooms, and many were grouped around or connected to open areas. These rooms were not just boxes. Each room had a purpose, even if we cannot always identify that purpose with certainty. Some spaces may have been used for storage, others for food preparation, sleeping, craft work, or household activity. A room used in the morning might serve a different function in the evening. Ancient houses were flexible places. They had to be. Most families could not simply decide that one room was only for decorative cushions and quiet reading, although that does sound pleasant. What survives now are mainly the lower parts of walls and foundations. The upper materials are mostly gone. The roofs are gone. The wooden beams, reed coverings, plaster, woven mats, door fittings, shelves, baskets, and most of the things that made the rooms feel lived in have disappeared. That means the modern viewer sees the town stripped down almost to a skeleton. The danger is to imagine the original settlement as bare stone too, but that would be misleading. Pavlopetrian life would have been full of perishable materials and movable objects. A room that now looks empty may once have held jars, cloth, tools, food, sleeping mats, containers, and people talking over one another in the usual household way. Courtyards are especially important in this kind of settlement. On a plan, a courtyard may appear as an open gap, and gaps can look less important than walls. But a courtyard in daily life can be one of the busiest places in a home or neighbourhood. It offers light. It offers air. It gives people space to work with materials that are too messy, smoky, bulky, or awkward for enclosed rooms. Food could be prepared there. Fibres could be sorted. Tools could be repaired. Children could be watched while adults worked. Visitors could be received without immediately bringing them into the private parts of the house. A courtyard is not empty. It is a working space with sky above it. In Pavlopetri, courtyards also help us think about social life. Were they private spaces belonging to individual households? Were some shared between groups of buildings? Did neighbours gather there? Did craft production take place in certain open areas? The answer may vary across the town. Some courtyards may have been domestic, others may have been connected with storage or work. The beauty of the site plan is that it allows those questions to be asked in detail. The frustration, naturally, is that the people who used the courtyards did not leave helpful little signs saying, "This is where we argued about fish prices," or, "Please note, weaving took place here on windy afternoons." Still, objects can help. Pottery, loom weights, storage jars, and other finds give clues about what happened in different areas. If loom weights are found in large numbers, textile production becomes part of the picture. If storage vessels are found, then storage and movement of goods become important. If certain types of pottery appear in particular zones, researchers can begin to think about function, trade, and activity. Archaeology is often a matter of matching spaces to things and things to habits. It is a slow conversation between layout and material. The town's burial spaces add another layer. Pavlopetri includes chamber tombs and cist graves. A cist grave is usually a small stone-built or stone-lined burial. It can be quite simple in form, but it represents a deliberate act of care. Someone made the space. Someone placed the body. Someone sealed or marked the burial. The presence of many cist graves in and around the settlement is one of the details that makes Pavlopetri feel deeply human. These were not just houses and streets. They were places tied to family, loss, and memory. Some reports and later interpretations have suggested that many of the smaller cist graves may have been associated with children, though that kind of interpretation must always be handled carefully. Even without assigning every grave to a specific age or identity, the number and placement of graves show that death was built into the landscape of the town. The dead were not hidden in a distant, separate place beyond all daily movement. They were close enough that the living would know where graves were, close enough that memory may have remained part of the household or neighbourhood setting. That closeness can feel unfamiliar. Many modern communities separate the living and the dead with fences, roads, official cemetery grounds, visiting hours, and maintenance schedules. In ancient settlements, the relationship could be different. A burial might be near a house or within a familiar area. The dead could remain part of the social geography. This does not mean people were casual about death. Quite the opposite. Keeping the dead close can show deep attachment. It can show that family identity and place were tied together. A grave near a house says, in a very physical way, this person belongs here. Then there are the chamber tombs, larger and more elaborate than simple cist graves. These were cut into rock, with a passage or entrance leading into a burial chamber. They required effort. They required planning. They may have been associated with people of higher status, or at least with different burial customs and social roles. A chamber tomb changes the landscape. It is not just a small grave placed into available space. It is a constructed place for the dead, one that may be returned to, reopened, remembered, or marked across time. The contrast between smaller cist graves and chamber tombs raises questions about social difference. Did some families have more power or wealth? Did certain people receive more elaborate treatment in death? Were burial forms connected to age, status, family group, ancestry, occupation, or period? Archaeology does not always give easy answers, and it is better to keep uncertainty than to pretend that every stone has whispered a full biography. But the variation itself is meaningful. Pavlopetri was not a flat community where every person was treated identically. Its burial record suggests difference, and difference is one of the signs of a complex social world. The placement of tombs also shapes how we understand the town's edges. Cities and towns are not only made by buildings, they are made by boundaries. Where does domestic space end? Where does burial space begin? Where do people work? Where do they gather? Where do they store valuable goods? Where does the road to the shore run? Pavlopetri's layout lets researchers think about these divisions. A wall is a boundary. A street is a connection. A tomb is a place of memory. A courtyard is a working gap. Put them together, and the town begins to show its internal logic. That logic was probably not created all at once. A settlement that lasted for a long period would have changed. Buildings may have been added, repaired, abandoned, rebuilt, or repurposed. Streets may have shifted as the needs of the town changed. Burial areas may have expanded. Some parts of the settlement may be earlier than others. Some walls may belong to different phases. The underwater plain we see now is not a single moment frozen perfectly in time. It is more like the combined trace of many moments. A town does not stay still while people live in it. It is always being adjusted, sometimes carefully, sometimes because a roof has failed and everyone has run out of patience. This is why careful mapping matters so much. In 1968, the site was recorded with hand tapes and a fixed grid system. That was demanding work, especially underwater. Imagine trying to measure an ancient wall while floating, breathing through equipment, watching your time, dealing with movement in the water, and trying not to disturb the site. A tape measure on land is one thing. A tape measure underwater is another thing entirely. It develops a personality. It drifts, bends, resists, and generally behaves as though it has somewhere better to be. Later projects used more advanced digital methods, including sonar and three-dimensional recording techniques. These tools allowed researchers to capture the layout with far greater precision. The difference is not just technological glamour, though underwater robots do have a certain charm. Better mapping means better interpretation. If you can record walls, alignments, elevations, and relationships accurately, you can ask more detailed questions about how the settlement worked. A small shift in a wall line may reveal a doorway. A group of stones may show a building phase. A narrow space may be a lane rather than a gap. Accuracy changes understanding. The town's shallow setting makes this mapping both possible and difficult. The remains lie in water shallow enough for light to reach and for divers to work, But shallow water is not always calm water. Waves, current, sand movement, and visibility can all affect recording. A sight that looks clear one day may be harder to read another day. The seabed itself is active, sediment moves, plants grow, stones become covered or uncovered. Pavlopetri is not sealed under glass. It is part of a living coastal environment. That living environment is one reason the town looks different at different moments. Sunlight can sharpen the walls or soften them. Sand can hide a line of stones or reveal it. Seagrass may obscure part of the plain. A diver's angle can change what is visible. The town is fixed in one sense, but the experience of seeing it is not fixed at all. You may look down and see only scattered stones. Then, as the light shifts, a street becomes clear. A room appears. A corner suddenly makes sense. It is as though the sight teaches the eye slowly. For the people who lived there, of course, no such interpretation was needed. They knew the layout because they used it. The streets were not archaeological features. They were the way to reach a neighbour, a storage room, a work area, the shore, or a tomb. The courtyards were not open spaces on a plan. They were where hands worked and voices carried. The buildings were not structures. They were places of habit. A person could have crossed the town half asleep in the morning and still known where to turn, which is a skill many of us continue to practice on the way to the kettle. The size of Pavlopetri also deserves attention. It was not a giant metropolis. Its known area is significant for a prehistoric settlement, but its scale remains human. You can imagine people recognizing one another. You can imagine news moving quickly from one side to the other. You can imagine social ties forming through repeated contact. A small town has its own intensity. Everyone may not know everything, but everyone knows enough to be dangerous at a family gathering. In such a place, streets and courtyards are not anonymous. They are social spaces. This human scale helps us imagine how daily routines were tied to architecture. A household might store goods in one room, sleep in another, prepare food in a courtyard, and move finished products toward a common route. If textile production was important, some spaces may have been associated with weaving, spinning, or storage of fibre. If trade was important, goods may have been gathered near routes to the shore. If certain families held status, their houses or tombs may have been placed or built differently. The plan is not just a map, it is the framework of everyday decisions. There is also the question of defence or protection. Pavlopetri does not seem to have been a heavily fortified city in the later classical sense. Its relationship to the sea and land may have been more about access and trade than strong defensive walls. But safety was still a concern. Coastal towns could face storms, raids, accidents, and conflicts. Visibility across the water mattered. Routes inland mattered. The layout may have reflected practical concerns about movement, storage, and response to danger. Even without great fortifications, the town would have had strategies for living in a risky world. Water access would have been essential. Freshwater is always a key issue for coastal settlement. The sea is very good at being beautiful and very bad at being drinkable. People needed reliable sources of fresh water for drinking, cooking, animals, and certain crafts. The broader area likely offered resources that made settlement possible, but maintaining access would have been one of the quiet foundations of daily life. A town can have trade, pottery, tombs, and charming courtyards, but without fresh water it becomes a very inconvenient camping trip. The relationship between buildings and the shoreline is another important part of the plan. Pavlopetri's location near a former coastline means the ancient town was shaped by access to the water. Some routes may have led naturally toward landing areas. Storage spaces may have been placed conveniently for moving goods. Work connected to boats, nets, cargo, or trade may have clustered where access was easiest. The modern shoreline is not the ancient shoreline, so researchers must reconstruct how land and sea once met. This is one of the tricky parts of studying submerged coastal sites. The map you see now is not the map people lived with then. Sea level change and land movement have altered the setting. Parts of what are now underwater were once dry land. That means the town's present appearance can mislead us if we forget the ancient landscape. A wall now surrounded by water may once have stood comfortably inland. A street now crossed by fish may once have connected dry spaces. A tomb now beneath the surface may once have been cut into rock beside a living settlement. To understand the town's shape, we have to mentally remove the water, raise the land, and place the coast back where it was. Easy enough to say, slightly harder to do without becoming a geologist, which is why specialists are useful and should be given biscuits. The tombs especially remind us that the town's current underwater state is not its original identity. People do not usually build graves intending them to become decorative features for sea creatures. These burial spaces were made in a dry, accessible landscape. Families could reach them. Rituals could take place there. The dead could be remembered there. Their presence underwater today tells us how much the land has changed. The sea now covers not only houses and streets, but also memory spaces that once mattered deeply. That change in setting adds emotional weight to the plan. The town is not just submerged architecture, it is submerged social geography. Places that once had meaning to families are now beneath the waves. A room that once held stored food now holds sand. A courtyard that once held work now holds rippling light. A grave that once marked a loss now lies underwater, its human story mostly beyond recovery. The physical plan survives, but the meanings attached to each space are partly gone. Archaeology tries to recover them carefully from what remains. There is a temptation to make every lost city feel mysterious in the same way, as though all old ruins must be hiding a secret. Pavlopetri does have mysteries, certainly. Its ancient name is unknown. Its exact political role is uncertain. The details of its decline remain debated, but its most important message is not hidden behind a riddle. It is visible in the plan. People here built an organised town. They shaped domestic space, working space, burial space, and routes of movement. They adapted the coast to their needs. They made a settlement that functioned for generations. That's enough to make the site extraordinary. Not because it proves something wildly unexpected, but because it gives rare evidence for something deeply important: ordinary urban life in the prehistoric Aegean. The layout helps bridge the gap between object and society. Pottery tells us what people used. Loom weights tell us what they made. Tombs tell us how they treated the dead. Streets and buildings show how all of that fitted together. If you imagine hovering above the site in clear water, you can begin to trace that fitting together. Here, a line of wall. There, another line meeting it. A space between them that might have channeled movement. A larger open area that may have allowed work or gathering. Nearby, the remains of graves. Beyond them, another group of buildings. The town is not speaking in full sentences, but it is giving grammar. It is showing how parts related to one another, and in that grammar the dead are not an afterthought. The tombs sit among the evidence of settlement, reminding us that any town is built from more than activity. It is built from attachment. People invest in places because they expect them to continue. They build houses because they plan to return to them. They bury the dead because memory matters. They create streets because movement will repeat tomorrow, and the next day, and the day after that. Pavlopetri's plan is a record of expectation. Its people expected life to go on there. For a long time, it did. The settlement changed, developed, and took part in wider Bronze Age networks. Then, over time, the sea altered its future. But before the town was submerged, its plan held the shape of confidence. Streets laid out for use, courtyards left open for work, rooms built for storage and shelter, tombs made with care. These were not the actions of people expecting their town to vanish. These were the actions of people making a place durable enough for daily life. There is something quietly humbling about that. We often imagine the ancient past through monuments meant to last. Pavlopetri gives us something else: the survival of practical spaces not necessarily designed for our admiration. The town did not preserve itself because it wanted to be impressive. It survived because its stones remained where people put them, and because the sea, after taking the town out of human use, left the plan visible enough for us to study. As the eye adjusts to the pattern of Pavlopetri, the settlement becomes less like a lost object and more like a set of choices. Someone chose where a wall should run. Someone chose how to divide a room. Someone chose where a courtyard should remain open. Someone chose where to place a grave. Someone carried stones, shaped spaces, repaired damage, and used the town until its layout became familiar. These choices were made by people whose names are gone, but whose decisions remain on the seabed. And that is perhaps the most useful way to look at the streets, courtyards, tombs, and rooms. Not as ruins first, but as decisions. Practical decisions, social decisions, family decisions, economic decisions. A town is a long argument with the landscape about how life should be arranged. Pavlopetri's argument was with the shore, the sea, trade, burial, work, and memory. For centuries, the people there arranged their world in stone, clay, fibre, and movement. Now the fibre is gone, the roofs are gone, the voices are gone, and the sea has taken the air from the streets. But the arrangement remains, so we can let the plan guide us a little farther. The buildings show that people needed shelter and storage. The courtyards show that work and light mattered. The streets show repeated movement and shared space. The graves show attachment, loss, and social meaning. The chamber tombs show effort and perhaps status. Taken together, they show a town that was not accidental. It was made, used, altered, remembered, and finally left to the water. And once the town's shape is clear, the next question naturally follows. What was moving through those streets? What filled those rooms? What goods were stored in those jars? What hands worked those loom weights? What cargo came in from the Aegean and went back out again? The stones give us the plan, but the objects begin to give us the economy, and the economy begins to show how Pavlopetri fitted into the wider Bronze Age world around it. If the streets of Pavlopetri show us where people moved, the objects found there begin to show us what moved with them. A town is not only walls and rooms, it is also the things carried through those rooms, the goods stored in jars, the fibres stretched across looms, the food prepared for families, the tools passed from hand to hand, and the cargo that arrived from somewhere beyond the horizon. Once we begin thinking about trade and work, the submerged stones become busier. The silent town beneath the water starts to fill again with ordinary movement. Pavlopetri sat in a place where movement mattered. The shore was close, and in the Bronze Age Aegean, the shore was not an edge where life stopped. It was the place where life opened outward. The sea connected communities across islands, peninsulas, bays and harbours. It carried goods more easily than rough land routes could. A boat could bring pottery, oil, tools, raw materials, food or news from another coastline. It could leave with cloth, stored produce, containers, and whatever else the town made, gathered or exchanged. To live at Pavlopetri was to live beside a road made of water. That road was not always safe. No ancient sailor looked at the Aegean and thought, how convenient, a perfectly reliable shipping lane. The sea could change its mood in an afternoon. Winds could delay travel. A boat could be damaged. Cargo could be lost. People could misjudge weather, distance, or the quality of someone else's advice, which has been a problem in every period of history. But despite those risks, the sea was still one of the great connectors of the Bronze Age world. It linked settlements that might otherwise have been separated by difficult mountains and long stretches of uneven land. In the Aegean, water did not isolate people as much as it joined them. Pavlopetri appears to have taken part in that wider system. Pottery recovered from the site includes fragments of large storage jars known as pithoi and transport containers. These were not decorative details, they were practical tools of an economy. Large jars meant storage, transport containers meant movement. A settlement with many such vessels was handling goods in amounts that mattered, whether for household supply, local exchange, or wider trade. A jar may seem humble, but in a world without cardboard boxes, shipping pallets, plastic tubs, glass bottles, or that drawer in the kitchen where every lid somehow fits no container at all, ceramic vessels were essential. A storage jar was a form of control. It allowed people to keep grain, oil, wine, pulses, or other goods safe for later use. It turned harvest and production into future security. A transport jar extended that control across distance. It allowed goods to leave one place and arrive in another with some hope of remaining useful when they got there. The shape, size, clay, and decoration of pottery can tell researchers where vessels may have been made, how they were used, and what networks they belonged to. In that sense, pottery is not just broken tableware. It is shipping evidence, household evidence, trade evidence, and sometimes social evidence, all in one. The fragments at Pavlopetri point toward contact with other parts of the Aegean world, including Crete, the Cyclades, and the northeast Aegean. These connections are important because they show the town was not isolated on its own small stretch of coast. Goods, styles, and perhaps people moved between Pavlopetri and other communities. A pot made elsewhere, or made in a style influenced by elsewhere, is a sign that the townspeople knew more than their immediate shoreline. They may have handled objects from distant places. They may have recognised foreign shapes. They may have traded with visitors who brought news from other ports. Imagine a boat arriving from Crete, or from an island settlement, or from another part of the mainland. It comes close to the shore, and people gather not because it is romantic, but because cargo is work. Jars must be lifted, seals or coverings checked, goods inspected. Someone has to count. Someone has to remember what was promised. Someone has to decide whether the contents are worth what is being asked. Someone, almost certainly, has to complain about the weight of the jar. The scene is not grand, but it is important. Trade is made from repeated practical tasks. A harbour town does not need massive public monuments to be significant. Its importance can be measured in movement, storage, and reliability. If boats know they can land there, if goods can be held there, if local production is steady, and if people have relationships with other communities, then the town becomes useful. Pavlopetri's position near the crossing between the mainland and Elafonisos would have made it well placed for coastal traffic. It may not have been the largest centre in the Aegean, but it did not need to be. Small and medium communities can play important roles in trade networks, especially when they sit in the right place and produce the right goods. One of the goods that may have mattered greatly at Pavlopetri was cloth. Archaeologists have found many loom weights at the site, and loom weights are among the clearest signs of textile production. They are not glamorous objects at first glance. They are usually pieces of clay or stone with holes or forms suited to hanging on the threads of a loom. If you put one in a museum case beside a gold cup, the gold cup will probably get more attention. Gold is very good at showing off, but loom weights are more useful for understanding daily life. They show work. They show production. They show skilled labour that often disappears from the record because cloth itself rarely survives. Textiles were central to ancient life. People needed clothing, blankets, sacks, coverings, straps and sails. Cloth could be used at home, exchanged locally or traded more widely. In some Bronze Age societies, textile production was highly organised and economically important. We should not imagine cloth as a minor craft done only in spare moments. It could require large amounts of time, labour and skill. Before a finished textile existed, fibre had to be gathered or produced, cleaned, prepared, spun into thread, set up on a loom, woven, finished, stored, used, or traded. Every stage took knowledge. A loom weight may look simple, but it points toward a whole chain of activity. Someone prepared the clay or selected the material. Someone shaped the weight. Someone dried or fired it. Someone tied it to threads. Someone worked at the loom, keeping tension even, passing the weft through the warp, beating the cloth into place, checking for mistakes, adjusting by touch and sight. The finished textile was not the result of one action. It was the outcome of many careful movements repeated over time. It was patient work, and probably not always peaceful work. Anyone who has ever tangled a piece of thread knows that fibres are capable of testing the human spirit. The presence of many loom weights at Pavlopetri suggests that weaving may have been more than a small household activity. It may have been a significant part of the town's economy. That does not mean the entire place was a factory in the modern sense. We should not picture rows of workers punching time cards while a Bronze Age supervisor frowns at a clipboard. It may have been domestic production carried out across households, or work organised around families, neighbourhoods, or local elites. The exact structure is difficult to know. But the number of loom weights tells us that textile work was visible enough to leave a strong archaeological trace. This is one of the quiet advantages of studying everyday objects. They bring people into focus who might otherwise remain invisible. Written records from later societies often preserve the names of kings, officials, landowners, generals, and men who had strong feelings about taxes. But the work of making food, cloth, containers, and household goods often belonged to people whose names were not recorded. At Pavlopetri, where writing has not given us a list of residents or workers, loom weights allow us to see the importance of hands at work. Those hands may have belonged to women, men, children learning a task, older specialists, or whole households. The objects do not name them, but they show that their work mattered. Textile production also connects Pavlopetri to the sea in a practical way. Cloth was needed for clothing and household use, but also for maritime life. Sails, ropes, coverings, bags, and wrapping materials all depended on fibres and woven goods. A coastal settlement involved in boating and trade would have had constant need for textile-related products. Even if Pavlopetri's weaving was mainly for household and trade goods rather than sail production, the broader relationship between fibre work and maritime life would have been close. Boats did not move cargo alone. They needed equipment, maintenance, and supplies. The daily economy of the town was probably mixed. Fishing, farming, herding, storage, craft production, and exchange all likely played roles. A community like Pavlopetri would not have survived on one activity. Coastal life rewards variety. The sea could provide fish and roots, the land could provide crops, animals, fuel, and building materials, craft work could create useful goods, trade could bring what was lacking and carry away what was produced in surplus. A household might be involved in several of these activities at once. One person weaving, another tending animals, another handling pottery, another joining a boat crew, another managing storage. Ancient life rarely allowed people to say, "That is not in my job description," unless they were very brave and surrounded by unusually patient relatives. The rhythm of production would have followed seasons. Agricultural goods came in cycles. Sailing seasons could depend on weather and wind. Textile work might intensify when fibres were available or when other labour demands were lower. Storage jars mattered because they smoothed out these seasonal changes. They allowed a town to hold goods after harvest, after production, or before trade. The difference between having enough and not having enough often depended on storage. A full jar was more than an object. It was reassurance. But jars also created responsibility. Stored goods had to be protected from pests, damp, breakage, theft, spoilage, and household members who claimed they were just checking the contents. Large containers needed space. They could be heavy, awkward, and difficult to move once filled. Their placement inside buildings or storage areas shaped how people used rooms. A room full of pithoi was not a casual sitting room. It was a managed space. People had to know what was inside, when it had been stored, who controlled it, and when it could be used. Control of storage may have created differences between households. Some families may have had more goods, more jars, more connections, or more influence in trade. Others may have depended on labour, exchange, or seasonal supply. The archaeology of storage can hint at social organisation, though it rarely gives us a complete picture. Large jars may belong to household economies, community storage, trade activity or local elites. The meaning depends on context. Pavlopetri's pottery and layout suggest an active settlement, but the precise balance of household and larger-scale control remains a matter for careful interpretation. Trade also brings questions of trust. In a world without standard printed contracts, digital receipts, or a customer support chatbot that somehow manages to be less helpful than silence, exchange depended on relationships. People needed to know who could be trusted, what goods were worth, whether weights and measures were fair, and whether promises would be kept. Regular contacts with other communities could create stable trade relationships. Families may have maintained links over time. A boat crew arriving from a familiar place might be welcomed differently from unknown visitors. The exchange of goods was also the exchange of reputation. Pottery helped manage some of this trust. Vessel shapes could be recognizable. Certain containers were associated with certain products or regions. A person familiar with Aegean trade may have known from the clay, form or style where a jar came from or what it was likely to contain. This kind of knowledge was practical, not academic. No one needed a museum label to know whether a jar looked local or foreign. Experience gave people categories. A trader, potter, household manager or storage keeper could read objects in ways we now try to reconstruct from fragments. The goods moving through Pavlopetri were part of a larger Bronze Age system. Crete, especially during the Minoan and later Mycenaean periods, was deeply connected to maritime exchange. The Cyclades sat across important sea routes. Mainland centres developed palatial systems and regional networks. Pavlopetri in southern Laconia belonged to this broad world of contact. It may have served as a local port, a production centre, or a node in coastal movement. Its importance likely changed over time as wider political and economic systems changed. That last point matters because ancient trade was not static. Networks expand, shift, weaken, and reorganise. A town can become more important when certain routes are favoured, then lose importance when those routes change. A coastline that is useful in one period may become less useful in another. A product that is valuable in one generation may be less valued later. Pavlopetri's long occupation means it would have experienced change. The people living there were not part of one unchanging Bronze Age scene. They adapted to different circumstances across centuries. One way to picture this is through the pottery itself. Earlier forms, later forms, local styles, imported influences, and changing vessel types all show time passing inside the settlement. Each piece belongs to a moment of use. A jar made in one period may have carried different meaning from a jar made centuries later. Some vessels may have been used until they broke. Others may have been repaired. Some may have been reused for purposes very different from their original design. People in the past were practical. If a vessel still worked, it did not need to retire just because a new style had appeared. The Bronze Age was not immune to fashion, but it was also not foolish enough to throw away every useful pot because it was last season's shape. The work of pottery itself deserves attention. Even if not all the pottery found at Pavlopetri was made there, people in the town would have understood pottery as part of daily life. Clay had to be sourced, prepared, shaped, dried, fired, and used. A good potter needed knowledge of materials, heat, form, thickness, and function. A storage jar had to be strong enough to hold its contents. A transport vessel had to survive handling. A cooking pot had to withstand heat. A pouring vessel had to pour without turning every meal into a small disaster. Pottery was technology, and good pottery improved life. Broken pottery also had uses. Sherds could be reused as scoops, scrapers, lids, markers, or building fill. Nothing needed to go to waste immediately. The ancient economy was full of reuse because materials required effort. A broken vessel was disappointing, yes, but not always useless. This habit of reuse is another small bridge between past and present. We still keep old jars, boxes, cloth scraps, and mysterious containers because surely they will be useful one day. The difference is that our cupboards reveal this habit faster than our archaeologists do. Trade goods did not move alone. People moved with them. A boat crew coming into Pavlopetri might bring sailors, traders, servants, labourers, specialists, family members, or messengers. Some may have stayed briefly, others may have settled, married, or formed long-term ties. Even when goods are the visible archaeological evidence, people are the real carriers of culture. They bring techniques, words, gestures, recipes, beliefs, and preferences. A new pottery style may arrive because objects were imported, but also because people saw those objects, liked them, copied them, adapted them, or wanted to show connection to a wider world. This makes Pavlopetri's everyday life richer than a simple list of goods. Trade was not just economic, it was social. A foreign jar in a household may have carried status. A cloth produced for exchange may have connected a local worker to distant users they would never meet. A boat arriving with cargo may have brought news of political change, conflict, marriage alliances, disease, harvests, or opportunities. The Aegean was a sea of information as much as a sea of objects. News itself could be valuable. A coastal town might hear about conditions elsewhere before inland communities did. Mariners carried reports of storms, shortages, safe anchorages, hostile groups, market opportunities, and technological habits. Pavlopetri's people may have known the wider world through repeated contact, not through maps in the modern sense, but through stories, routes, and remembered journeys. The mental map of a Bronze Age trader was made of coastlines, winds, landmarks, harbours, dangers, and people. It was practical geography. There is a tendency to imagine prehistoric people as local and limited, but coastal communities often had wide horizons. A person living at Pavlopetri may not have travelled far personally, but the town's goods and visitors could connect them to places they never saw. A child might grow up seeing pottery styles from elsewhere, hearing unfamiliar speech from passing traders, watching boats leave for destinations described in household conversation. The sea made the outside world present. The economy of Pavlopetri would have been built from both visible and invisible labour. Visible labour includes carrying jars, sailing boats, weaving cloth, grinding grain, repairing buildings, tending animals, and making tools. Invisible labour includes planning, remembering, teaching, negotiating, organising storage, caring for children, maintaining relationships, and watching conditions. A town works only when both forms of labour happen. Archaeology finds many tools, but it is harder to find planning. It finds storage jars, but not always the person who remembered exactly what was inside them. It finds loom weights, but not the backache after hours of weaving. This is why small finds matter. They point toward human effort. Loom weights tell us someone spent time producing textiles. Pithoi tell us someone stored goods in quantity. Transport containers tell us goods moved. Pottery styles tell us contact existed. Together, these objects create a picture of a town that was active, connected, and productive. Not a palace capital, perhaps, and not a place designed mainly for display, but a working community with economic life rooted in the shore. The sound of that economy would have been steady, not loud in the modern industrial sense, but layered. The scrape of ceramic against stone, threads being worked, animals moving, grain being ground, people calling from one space to another, boats being handled, a jar being set down with the careful heaviness that says nobody wants to break it, tools tapping, wood creaking, wind in cloth, water at the shore. It is easy to think of ancient ruins as silent because we meet them after life has left. But in use, Pavlopetri would have had a working soundscape. There would also have been moments of waiting. Waiting for a boat, waiting for weather to improve, waiting for goods to be ready, waiting for fibres to dry, waiting for a kiln or fire, waiting for someone who said they would return soon, a word that has always been dangerously flexible. Trade involves motion, but also delay. A coastal economy depends on conditions beyond human control. The sea decides when movement is easy. The wind decides whether plans are sensible. People can prepare, but they cannot command the weather. That uncertainty would have shaped the mood of the town. A good trading position brought opportunity, but also exposure. Visitors could bring wealth, but also disease, conflict, or pressure. Goods could enrich a household, but their loss could harm it. Production could create status, but also demand labour. A town engaged with wider networks was never completely independent. Changes elsewhere could reach it. If demand shifted, if a route became unsafe, if a major centre declined, smaller connected towns could feel the effects. Pavlopetri's life by the sea was therefore both useful and vulnerable. Still, the evidence of trade and textile production gives the town a strong sense of purpose. It was not merely a cluster of houses near water, it was part of a regional system. Its people made things, stored things, received things, and sent things away. They may have handled goods from powerful centres, but they also contributed to the economy in their own right. The loom weights are especially important here because they show production from within the town. Pavlopetri was not just receiving objects from elsewhere, it was likely making goods that had value. There is something satisfying about that. A submerged city can easily become a passive image, something lost, covered, and looked at. But Pavlopetri was active. It had output. It had working households. It had goods that may have entered wider circulation. Its people were not simply sitting at the edge of history waiting for the sea to arrive. They were participating in a busy Aegean world. If we return to the town plan with this in mind, the spaces begin to change. A room is no longer just a room. It may be storage for goods that arrive by boat. A courtyard may be a place where fibre was prepared or tools repaired. A street may be the route by which jars move from shore to household. A tomb may belong to a family whose identity was tied to production or trade. The whole layout becomes connected to work. The stones are the frame, and the objects are the activity inside it. The economy also helps explain why people may have stayed there for so long. A settlement survives when it can support people across generations. Pavlopetri's location, access to the sea, craft production, storage capacity and trade links likely gave it resilience. It had more than one way to sustain itself. A purely agricultural village might struggle differently from a coastal town with exchange connections. A purely trading station might depend too heavily on passing traffic. Pavlopetri appears to have combined domestic life, production, storage, and maritime connection, giving it a practical foundation. Of course, no foundation lasts forever. Trade networks can break. Coastlines can change. The sea that brought contact can also bring erosion and danger. The same shoreline that made Pavlopetri useful would eventually become part of its undoing. But before the water took over its streets, the town was plugged into the wider life of the Aegean. Its jars, loom weights, and pottery fragments preserve that fact in small, durable pieces. And perhaps that is what makes the everyday echoes of Pavlopetri so moving. They are not dramatic objects, they are not royal treasures, they are not weapons from a famous battle. They are things connected to storage, carrying, weaving, eating, working, and exchanging. They are the remains of ordinary systems that kept people alive and connected. The humble objects are doing the most generous work. They let us see the town not as a drowned mystery, but as a functioning place filled with labour and decisions. A large jar on the floor, threads hanging from loom weights, a boat pulled near shore, a family counting what they have stored, a worker checking cloth, a trader recognising a vessel from elsewhere, a child watching cargo arrive, someone carrying news from another island. Someone grumbling because the jar is too heavy, the wind is wrong, or the person who promised to help has wandered off at the exact wrong moment. These are not details we can prove one by one, but they are the kinds of ordinary realities that the evidence points toward. Pavlopetri's trade and textile work give us a town of hands shaping clay, hands tying thread, hands lifting cargo, hands sealing jars, hands repairing boats, hands passing objects across thresholds, hands placing goods into storage and taking them out again when needed. Those hands are gone, but their work left traces. Low walls show where they moved. Pottery shows what they used. Loom weights show what they made. The shoreline shows why the town mattered. As the evidence gathers, the sea above Pavlopetri feels less like an ending and more like a layer placed over an active human world. Under that water is not only a plan of streets and buildings, it is the outline of an economy. The town had daily rhythms, seasonal pressures, outside contacts, skilled production, and stored wealth. It belonged to the Aegean not because it was large or famous, but because it was connected. And that connection makes the next part of the story more powerful, because a place so tied to the shore could benefit from the sea for generations, and then, little by little, become threatened by the same water that had helped sustain it. A harbour can become too shallow, too exposed, or too wet. A familiar path can flood. A working courtyard can become useless. A shoreline can move in ways no family wants to accept. Pavlopetri's life was shaped by the sea, and eventually its future would be shaped by the sea as well. The end of Pavlopetri's life as a dry town was probably not a single dramatic moment. It was probably not one clean scene where the ground cracked, the waves rushed in, and everyone ran toward higher land while dropping pottery in a way that would be very convenient for future archaeologists. Real environmental change is often less theatrical than that. It can be slow, uneven, and difficult to recognise while it is happening. A familiar stretch of shore floods a little more often. A low path stays wet longer after storms. A landing place becomes less sheltered. A building close to the water needs repairs again. And then one day the repair stops seeming worth the effort. That is the quieter story Pavlopetri asks us to consider. A town that began as a useful coastal settlement did not simply fall into the sea like a stone dropped from a hand. It lived for a long time beside the water, worked with the water, depended on the water, and then slowly found itself on the wrong side of a changing shoreline. The same sea that had carried goods, visitors, fish, and news toward the settlement began, over centuries, to take more space for itself. Very rude, really, though one must admit the sea has always had a talent for expanding its claims without filling in the proper paperwork. To understand how Pavlopetri slipped beneath the waves, we need to begin with the ancient landscape. Today, the remains lie beneath shallow water near the coast of southern Laconia, between the mainland and Elafonisos. But when the settlement was alive, this area looked different. The town stood on or near an isthmus, a strip of land that linked Elafonisos with the mainland. That is important, because an isthmus can create shelter. It can turn an exposed coast into something more useful for boats. It can help form a natural embayment or lagoon, giving vessels a safer place to approach, wait, unload, or take cover from wind. A town in that position had good reasons to exist. It was close to maritime routes, close to land resources, and placed at a crossing point between shore and island. If the isthmus helped protect the water nearby, then Pavlopetri may have had a practical advantage for seafaring and exchange. Boats do not need luxury, but they do appreciate not being smashed about by wind and waves while someone tries to unload a heavy jar. A sheltered landing area could make trade easier, safer, and more predictable. The people of Pavlopetri likely knew this very well. Their settlement belonged to the coastline not by accident, but because the coastline gave it a role. But coastlines are not fixed. They seem fixed to us because our lives are short and our maps are confident. A printed map has a way of making land look permanent. It draws a line between blue and beige and says there, that is the coast. But the actual coast is less obedient. It moves with storms, sediment, sea level change, erosion, tectonic shifts, and the long adjustments of land and water. A shoreline is not a wall. It is an argument, and at Pavlopetri, that argument continued for thousands of years. Sea level itself has changed greatly since the end of the last ice age. As ice sheets melted, global sea levels rose and low coastal areas around the world were flooded. Many prehistoric communities would have lived on land that is now underwater. Pavlopetri belongs to a later and more local version of that wider story. The site was not submerged only because the global ocean rose like water in a bath. Local tectonics also mattered. Southern Greece is a restless region, shaped by plate movement and earthquakes. Land can rise in one area and sink in another. The ground beneath a town can shift by small amounts over long periods, or by sudden movements during earthquakes. These changes can be small enough to escape daily notice at first, but large enough over centuries to transform a settlement's future. This is one of the difficult things about living in a changing landscape. People are good at noticing disasters. We notice the storm that destroys a roof, the flood that enters a house, the earthquake that cracks a wall. We are less good at noticing gradual trends. A little more flooding than before, a little more salt in the soil, a little more erosion along the shore. A low area that used to stay dry now becomes marshy in winter. Each event can be explained away. Bad weather, an unlucky season, a poor repair. The tide was high, the wind was strong, but over time the pattern becomes harder to ignore. At Pavlopetri, researchers think a combination of sea level rise and tectonic activity caused the town to become submerged. The precise sequence is complicated, and not every part of the town may have gone underwater at the same time. Some areas may have become damp, flood-prone, or unusable before others. The ancient settlement may have been gradually reduced in usefulness long before its remains reached the underwater state we see today. In other words, Pavlopetri did not need to be fully underwater to become difficult to live in. It only needed to become less safe, less convenient, less profitable, or less connected than it had been before. Think of a family living near the edge of the settlement. Their house has always been close to the shore, which used to be useful. The water meant boats, fish, and breeze. Then storms begin to reach farther inland. A storage area floods once. The floor is cleaned. Jars are moved. The wall is repaired. It is annoying, but life continues. Then another flood comes. Salt water damages goods. A path becomes muddy. A neighbour moves storage to a higher spot. Someone says the old landing place is no longer as sheltered as it used to be. Someone else says it has always been like this, because people in every century have enjoyed arguing with evidence when the evidence is inconvenient. Gradually the household adapts. Perhaps they build a little higher. Perhaps they stop using one room. Perhaps they shift work into a drier courtyard. Perhaps a storage jar is moved inland. Perhaps boats begin to prefer another landing place. None of this requires a single catastrophic day. It is the slow work of decline. A town can begin to empty not because everyone panics, but because each generation finds slightly better reasons to live or trade somewhere else. The isthmus may have been especially important in this process. If the strip of land connecting the mainland and Elafonisos became inundated, the local marine setting would change. A protected embayment could become a more open channel. Boats that once found shelter might face more wind and wave exposure. A harbour-like environment could become less useful. For a coastal town whose life depended partly on maritime movement, that would matter. It is one thing to lose a bit of ground. It is another to lose the safe water that helped make your town valuable. A settlement can survive many inconveniences if its main purpose remains strong. People will repair, rebuild, and endure quite a lot when a place still feeds them, connects them, and supports their families. But once the main advantage weakens, the calculation changes. If trade routes shift, if a landing place becomes dangerous, if storage becomes harder, if the land floods, if a wider political or economic system collapses, then a town can lose momentum. Pavlopetri's abandonment may not have been caused only by water. It may have been part of a wider set of pressures affecting the Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean. Around the end of the 2nd millennium BC, many major Bronze Age societies in the Eastern Mediterranean experienced disruption. Palatial centres declined or collapsed. Trade networks broke down or changed. Warfare, migration, internal instability, climate stress, earthquakes, and economic shifts have all been discussed by scholars as parts of that larger picture. Pavlopetri's decline may have been connected to this world of instability. If its role depended on trade and maritime exchange, then the breakdown of wider networks could have hurt it badly. A port town without reliable trade is like a kettle without water, still shaped for its purpose, but no longer doing its finest work. There is also the possibility that earthquakes played a more direct role. Southern Greece is seismically active, and earthquakes can damage buildings, change shorelines, trigger local subsidence, and disturb coastal systems. A strong earthquake could crack walls, alter ground levels, or make a vulnerable settlement much harder to maintain. A series of earthquakes would be even worse. People might repair after one event. After several, especially if trade and social systems were already weakening, they might leave. There comes a point when resilience becomes exhaustion. It is worth being careful here. We should not imagine that we can stand on the shore of Pavlopetri and say, "This exact earthquake ended the town," with the confidence of someone announcing the winner of a baking competition. The evidence suggests processes, not a neat single cause. Sea level rise, tectonic subsidence, changing shoreline conditions, possible earthquakes, and wider Bronze Age disruption all belong in the discussion. Pavlopetri's story is likely a mixture. The town did not have one enemy. It had time, water, geology, and history all leaning on it at once. And yet, from the point of view of the people living there, those large causes would have appeared as ordinary problems: a cracked wall, a flooded path, a ruined store, a boat delayed or lost, a trading contact no longer arriving, a family choosing to move. A courtyard abandoned, a burial area becoming harder to reach. The great forces of history usually enter daily life wearing small shoes. They arrive as chores, repairs, shortages, worry, and conversations held at thresholds. Imagine standing in Pavlopetri at a late stage of its life. The town is still recognisable, streets remain, houses stand, people still work. But something has changed. Perhaps some buildings near the lowest ground are already damaged. Perhaps the shoreline is closer than older people remember. Perhaps a section of land that once connected easily to Elafonisos is flooded more often. The water has begun to alter the town's habits. Children are told not to play in places where their parents once ran freely. Goods are stored farther from the shore. Boats do not always come in where they used to. The settlement is still alive, but its future is becoming uncertain. For the people there, leaving would not have been simple. Home is not just a practical arrangement. It is memory, family, burial, routine, and identity. The graves around Pavlopetri make this especially clear. The dead were part of the landscape. To abandon the settlement was not only to move away from houses and workspaces, it was to move away from ancestors, from familiar tombs, from places where people had been buried with care. That kind of departure carries emotional weight. Even when leaving is sensible, it can feel like a failure, or a loss, or a betrayal of those who stayed in the ground. But practical life can be very persuasive. A town that cannot protect food, receive boats, support trade, or remain dry cannot rely on sentiment alone. Families may have moved gradually. Some perhaps went inland. Some may have joined nearby communities. Some may have kept using parts of the site seasonally, or for specific purposes after full domestic life declined. Later evidence suggests the area saw some limited reoccupation or use in later periods, so the place did not simply vanish from human awareness in one clean break. It changed role. A living Bronze Age town became a changed landscape, then a partly submerged place, then eventually an underwater archaeological site. The physical sinking of Pavlopetri may have continued after the main Bronze Age occupation had ended. This is another useful distinction. The abandonment of the town and the submergence of the ruins are related, but they are not necessarily the same event. People may have left because the settlement's social, economic or environmental conditions worsened, while the final underwater state developed across later centuries through subsidence and sea level change. In this way, Pavlopetri's story has two endings, or rather, two transformations. First, the town stops functioning as a living community. Later, the sea completes the process of covering its remains. That difference matters because it protects us from the most dramatic but least accurate version of the story. The underwater city was not necessarily a drowned town full of people on the day the waves came in. It was more likely a settlement that declined, was abandoned or greatly reduced, and then over time became submerged. This is less like a disaster film and more like watching a house slowly disappear behind sand dunes, except the dunes are water, tectonic movement, and several thousand years of coastal change. Not as convenient for a movie trailer perhaps, but much better for understanding what probably happened. The geology around Pavlopetri gives us a setting where this kind of transformation makes sense. The region lies within the active eastern Mediterranean, where tectonic forces have long-shaped coastlines. Earthquakes can cause sudden changes, but they also belong to longer patterns of uplift and subsidence. One coastline may rise, preserving ancient shorelines above modern sea level. Another may sink, placing old settlements below it. Greece contains both kinds of evidence, which is one reason it is such an important region for studying submerged prehistoric landscapes. The land has been moving while people have been living on it, which is a rather important detail, even if the land has not always been considerate enough to mention it. At Pavlopetri, studies of sea level, geomorphology, archaeology, and the seabed suggest that the area's relationship to the sea changed substantially over time. Marine researchers have examined the channel, the shoreline, and the underwater remains to understand how the settlement became submerged and how the site has endured. They have considered tectonic movement, eustatic sea level rise, wave action, near-shore currents, and sediment movement. That combination of processes is not easy to turn into one simple sentence, which is why headlines often reach for sunken city and leave the poor geomorphology standing outside in the rain. But the details are worth keeping. Sea level rise alone is not always enough to explain why one site is submerged while another nearby site is not. Local land movement matters, wave exposure matters, sediment cover matters, the shape of the seabed matters, the condition of the ancient walls matters. Pavlopetri survived not only because it sank, but because it sank in a way that left parts of its plan visible. The water damaged the site, yes, but it also preserved it from later construction and farming. It hid it, but did not erase it. The walls themselves show how low and vulnerable the remains now are. Many survive only one course high, or flush with the seabed. Some parts are covered by marine growth, some are exposed to movement of sand and water. The original buildings likely had stone foundations with upper sections made of mud brick, timber, plaster, or other perishable materials. Once abandoned, those upper parts would have collapsed, eroded, or disappeared. The stone bases remained. Then the sea moved over them. What we see now is the most durable part of the town after time has removed the rest, with great patience and very poor manners. The idea of sinking can make Pavlopetri sound passive, as if the town simply lost a fight with water. But the people who lived there likely responded actively for as long as they could. Coastal communities are used to adaptation. They repair storm damage, they alter landing places, they move storage, they build drainage, they learn which areas flood, they adjust calendars and labour, they teach children where not to walk. The end of a town is rarely just nature acting and humans waiting helplessly. It is a long negotiation. People resist, adapt, compromise, and eventually choose whether to stay. Perhaps there were debates. We cannot know, but it would be strange if there were not. Some people may have wanted to remain because their families, graves, and goods were there. Others may have argued for moving because the water was becoming a problem. Traders may have noticed fewer boats. Farmers may have worried about salt. Household managers may have disliked losing storage. Older people may have insisted that previous generations endured worse. Younger people may have looked toward other places with more opportunity. Every community under pressure becomes a place of competing memories and plans. The decision to abandon a settlement is not always made all at once. One family leaves, then another. A building is no longer repaired. A courtyard falls out of use. A street becomes quieter. A grave is visited less often. Goods are moved to a nearby settlement. Boats stop calling as often. The town remains, but it thins. Eventually what was once a living place becomes a place people pass through, then a place people remember, then a place people no longer name correctly, then a scatter of stones known to locals, then a site waiting for archaeology. The sea, meanwhile, continues. It does not hurry. It enters low areas. It covers floors. It fills cracks. It brings sand, shells, plants, and small creatures. Fish move through spaces that once held smoke and speech. Waves rub at stones. Storms shift sediment. The town plan is gradually simplified. Perishable materials vanish. Objects are broken, buried, moved, or exposed. Some pottery stays, some is carried away. Some stones remain in lines. Others fall, tilt, or become hidden. The living city becomes a seabed pattern. There is sadness in that, but not only sadness. There is also preservation. If Pavlopetri had remained on dry land, later centuries might have destroyed much more of it. People might have built over it, quarried it, ploughed it, or scattered it beyond recognition. The sea took the town out of ordinary human use, but it also kept later hands from rearranging it too much. That is why its plan can still be studied. The underwater setting is both loss and protection, damage and shelter. The sea is a thief, yes, but in this case it also became an accidental archivist, which is probably the most flattering job title the sea has ever received. The phrase "slipped beneath the sea" sounds gentle, and in some ways it may have been. Not gentle for the people making decisions, perhaps, but gradual in the physical sense. A town can descend into the water through many small changes rather than one spectacular plunge. This kind of slow loss can be harder to imagine because it lacks a single scene. But it is closer to how many places disappear. The line between usable and unusable shifts. A settlement becomes inconvenient before it becomes impossible. People leave before the last stone is covered. By the time the water fully claims the place, the life that once filled it may already be elsewhere. And that should make us think carefully about the word hidden. Pavlopetri was not hidden because someone meant to conceal it. It became hidden because the landscape changed. The town's disappearance was not a secret plan. It was the result of environmental and historical processes unfolding across human generations and then across centuries. The sea covered the evidence, but the causes were written in geology, climate, tectonics, trade, and human choice. The submerged city also has a modern echo. Around the world today, coastal communities face rising seas, erosion, stronger storms, subsidence, and difficult questions about whether to protect, adapt, or retreat. Pavlopetri is not a simple warning from the past, and we should not force it to be one. The world of the Bronze Age was very different from ours. But it does remind us that coastlines change and that human settlements are often built on assumptions of stability that nature does not always share. People have always liked living by water. Water brings food, movement, beauty, and trade. It also keeps its own schedule. Pavlopetri's people could not have known that thousands of years later their town would become famous because it was underwater. They may have known only that the place was becoming harder to maintain, or that trade was weakening, or that damage had become too frequent. They may have left with practical concerns uppermost in mind: where to live next, what to carry, which animals to move, which jars were worth saving, who would help older relatives, and how to remember the dead left behind. Archaeology often sees the final result. Life experiences the messy middle. So the town slipped beneath the sea not just through geology, but through decisions. The ground moved, the water rose, the shoreline changed, trade systems weakened, earthquakes may have damaged the settlement, and people responded. At some point, staying no longer made sense. At some later point, the sea covered what remained. And there Pavlopetri stayed, not gone, not fully preserved, not fully destroyed, waiting in shallow water. If we picture it after abandonment but before full submergence, it may have been a strange place. Walls still standing low, some rooms empty, some roofs gone, tombs still visible, paths partly overgrown or flooded, a former courtyard open to the weather. Perhaps people from nearby areas came to collect materials or visit graves. Perhaps children were warned that the old town was unsafe. Perhaps it became a place of stories before it became a place of silence. Then, as the centuries passed, the water rose over more of it. Dry stone became wet stone. Roads became seabed. Memory became rumour. Rumour became nothing. But the stones remained. And this is where the story turns, very slowly, toward rediscovery. Because a town under shallow water is hidden only until someone looks closely enough. The sea covered Pavlopetri, but not deeply. It lay there where sunlight could reach it, where a swimmer might see lines beneath the surface, where a geologist or diver might notice that the seabed was not entirely natural. The town had slipped out of history, but it had not slipped beyond sight. It was still there, waiting for the moment when modern eyes would understand that these were not just stones underwater, but streets, buildings, courtyards, tombs, and the remains of a living town that had once stood dry beside the Aegean. For a long time after Pavlopetri slipped out of ordinary use, the stones remained where they were, lying beneath clear shallow water, close enough to shore that they were never truly unreachable, but strange enough that their meaning was easy to miss. A fisherman might have noticed a line on the seabed. A swimmer might have seen squared stones beneath the surface. Someone walking the coast might have heard that there were old remains under the water near the little islet. But seeing stones and understanding a town are two very different things. The past can sit in plain sight for centuries and still wait for the right kind of attention. That is one of the quiet lessons of Pavlopetri. Discovery is not always a single heroic moment. Sometimes it happens in layers. One person notices, another records, another returns with better tools. Someone else connects the evidence to a wider story. A site becomes known not because it suddenly appears, but because people finally understand what they are looking at. Pavlopetri was not raised from the seabed, it was recognised. The first modern note of submerged archaeological remains in the area came in 1904, when the Greek geologist Phokion Negris identified ancient remains beneath the water off the coast of southeastern Laconia. This was an important observation, but its significance was not widely recognised at the time. That may seem surprising now, when Pavlopetri is famous as one of the world's oldest known submerged towns, but archaeology has always had a long waiting room. A discovery can be reported, filed, half-remembered, and left quietly in the corner until another generation comes along with different questions, better equipment, and perhaps a slightly stronger sense that a line of stones under the water might deserve more attention than a polite shrug. The site was remote, and remoteness can be a very effective form of camouflage. Pavlopetri lies near Panta Beach and the island of Elafonisos, in clear, shallow water, but in the early 20th century it was not a place easily placed at the centre of international archaeological interest. Underwater archaeology itself was still developing. The tools, methods and institutional support needed to study submerged sites properly were limited. It was difficult enough to excavate and map sites on land, or at least the measuring tapes were not trying to float away and everyone could breathe without equipment. Underwater work added another layer of difficulty, so the stones remained, known in some way, but not yet fully understood. Then, in 1967, Nicholas Fleming visited the area and recognised the significance of the submerged remains. Fleming was a marine geologist and oceanographer, trained to think about coastlines, sea levels, and the relationship between land and water. That background mattered. Where others might have seen ruins in a scenic bay, he saw evidence of a prehistoric town in a changed landscape. He understood that these remains were not simply odd stones or later harbour debris. They belonged to something older and more organised. In that moment, Pavlopetri returned to archaeology in a serious way. It is worth pausing on the kind of looking this required. A submerged town does not announce itself with a sign saying, "Please note, Bronze Age urban plan below." The remains were low, broken and partly covered. The water shifted light over them. Sand and marine growth softened the edges. The viewer had to see pattern where the sea had made everything shimmer. Straight lines, corners, room divisions, a repeated arrangement of walls. It took knowledge and patience to recognise that the stones formed a plan. Pavlopetri had been waiting, but it had not made the job easy. Ancient sites rarely do. They prefer to sit there with the calm attitude of someone who knows you will have to work for the answer. After Fleming identified and confirmed the prehistoric nature of the town, a team from the University of Cambridge surveyed the remains in 1968. This was careful, practical, underwater work. The team spent 6 weeks mapping the site using a fixed grid system and hand tapes. No dramatic computer models, no robotic vehicles. No instant three-dimensional scan. Just people in the water, measuring, recording, checking alignments, and slowly turning stones into a plan. There is something almost heroic about that, although the heroism is the quiet kind that involves patience, damp equipment, and the ability to remain calm while a tape measure behaves like a sea creature with opinions. The Cambridge survey produced a plan of a prehistoric town lying in shallow water. They identified building complexes made up of multiple rooms, streets, courtyards, 2-chamber tombs, and dozens of kissed graves. They also recorded evidence that the underwater site continued toward Pavlopetri Island and noted an extensive cemetery on the pound to shore. The finds recovered from the seabed, including pottery, obsidian and chert blades, and a bronze figurine, suggested activity from the early to the late Bronze Age. At the time, the buildings were mainly associated with the Mycenaean period because of the pottery available for study. Later research would push the earliest occupation much farther back, but the 1968 work had already done something remarkable. It had shown that Pavlopetri was not a legend, not a vague underwater curiosity, but an organised prehistoric settlement with a readable plan. Imagine being one of those divers in 1968, floating above the shallow seabed with a tape in hand. The water is clear but never perfectly still. The sun moves overhead. The line of a wall appears, then the eye follows it to a corner, then another wall, then a space that may have been a room. Each measurement adds a little more certainty. The site stops being a scatter and becomes a town. A wall here, a courtyard there, a street between, a grave nearby. The process is slow, but each recorded point pulls the hidden city slightly closer to the surface of understanding. This kind of work requires a special relationship with time. The divers were not only moving through water, they were moving through a delay of thousands of years. A stone placed by Bronze Age hands had to be measured by modern hands. A street walked by people whose names are lost had to be traced by someone breathing through a snorkel or diving gear. That is archaeology at its best. Not a treasure hunt, not a dramatic conquest of the past, but a careful act of recognition. One human being notices the work of another across a gap so large that ordinary imagination struggles with it. After the 1968 survey, Pavlopetri did not immediately become a site of continuous excavation and study. In fact, for about 40 years, no major new fieldwork was carried out there. The site came under the care and protection of the Greek state, but detailed research paused. This long quiet period may sound frustrating, but it also reflects the realities of underwater archaeology. Fieldwork requires permits, teams, funding, specialist equipment, conservation planning, and good research questions. It is not enough to know a site exists. To study it properly, one must return with the right methods, and sometimes those methods have not yet arrived. In a way, that pause protected Pavlopetri from being studied too early with inadequate tools. The early survey had captured the essential plan, but later technology would allow much more detailed recording. Archaeology often benefits from waiting, though archaeologists themselves are not always famous for enjoying it. By the early 21st century, underwater survey methods had changed dramatically. Digital mapping, sonar, photogrammetry, robotic total stations, and remote-operated equipment could record submerged sites with a level of precision that earlier teams could only have dreamed about, probably while trying to untangle another measuring tape. The return to Pavlopetri began through renewed scholarly interest. In 2007, Chrysanthi Gallu, then a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Nottingham, reassessed the 1968 finds as part of wider research on prehistoric Laconia. Discussions followed with underwater archaeologist John Henderson about the possibility of returning to the site. Then, in 2008, Gallu, Henderson and Nicholas Fleming visited Pavlopetri again, 40 years after the Cambridge survey. They found that the remains were still well preserved on the sea floor. That visit helped shape a new 5-year project in collaboration with the Greek Ephyret of underwater antiquities. There is something satisfying about Fleming returning to the site after all those years. The person who had recognised Pavlopetri in 1967 came back to see what the next generation of archaeologists might do with it. That is not only a scientific continuity, it is a human one. The site had outlasted Bronze Age households, ancient trade, shoreline change, and centuries of obscurity. It could certainly wait 40 years for better equipment. When the team returned, the stones were still there, patient as ever, which is more than can be said for many of us waiting in a queue for coffee. In 2009, the Pavlopetri Underwater Archaeology Project began its first major season of modern fieldwork. The work was led by a joint Greek and British team, including Elias Spondylis from the Ephyret of Underwater Antiquities and John Henderson from the University of Nottingham, with Nicholas Fleming contributing to studies of sea level change and tectonics. The project's goals were clear and ambitious. The team wanted to record the surviving architecture accurately, study artefacts across the site, understand when the settlement was occupied, investigate what it was used for, and examine how the town and surrounding strait became submerged. This is where rediscovery becomes something more than finding. It becomes re-seeing. The 1968 survey had shown the plan. The new project aimed to measure the town in digital detail, connect the architecture with the artefacts, and place the site within its environmental and maritime setting. It was not enough to say, "There is a sunken town here." The real questions were, how old is it? How large is it? How did it function? How did it connect with trade? How did the coastline change? How can it be protected? Those questions turned Pavlopetri from a famous underwater curiosity into a research landscape. The 2009 work used modern digital survey techniques, including a shore-based robotic total station and high-frequency sector scanning sonar. These tools allowed the team to record the site more quickly and accurately than the earlier methods. Divers could take points on the seabed while the total station recorded positions from shore. Sonar could scan structural remains and help map features that were difficult to capture by hand. The result was not just a prettier plan, it was more precise evidence. Better recording meant researchers could study walls, streets, alignments, and structures in ways that were not possible in 1968. This does not make the earlier work less impressive. Quite the opposite. The 1968 team had done the foundational job under much harder recording conditions. The later technology built on that effort. It is a little like comparing a hand-drawn map made by someone walking across difficult ground with a satellite image. The satellite image gives more detail, but the first map may be the reason anyone knew where to look. Pavlopetri's modern rediscovery is a chain of work, Negris noting remains, Fleming recognising the prehistoric town, Cambridge mapping it, and later teams returning with digital tools. During the renewed investigations, the site also revealed that its history was older than previously thought. The discovery of late Neolithic pottery showed that occupation reached back at least 5,000 years, and perhaps more. This was a major shift. The town was not only a Mycenaean or later Bronze Age settlement. Its story began much earlier, in the final Neolithic or early Bronze Age, making it one of the earliest known submerged towns with a preserved plan. That kind of discovery changes the scale of the site. Pavlopetri was no longer just a Bronze Age coastal town underwater. It became a rare window into the early development of settled coastal life and maritime trade in the Mediterranean. For the divers and archaeologists, each small find mattered. A sherd of pottery could alter the dating, a line of stones could expand the town's known area, a concentration of objects could suggest a working zone, a grave could change the understanding of the cemetery. Underwater, small finds can be difficult to spot and record. They may be partly buried in sand, shifted by water, or hidden among stones. The work requires discipline. A diver must resist the temptation to grab, disturb, or simplify. Archaeology underwater is not collecting. It is documenting context. An object is most valuable when its location, association, and relationship to the site are understood. That point is important because submerged sites are vulnerable. A visitor might see a small piece of pottery and think it harmless to take it. After all, there are so many fragments, but removing even a small object can damage the evidence. A sherd taken from its place loses much of its archaeological meaning. It becomes a souvenir instead of a clue. Pavlopetri has faced threats from anchors, tourism, looting, sediment movement, and nearby maritime activity. Rediscovery brought attention, but attention has to be managed carefully. A site can be loved to death if admiration is not paired with protection. The divers who followed the stones were therefore not only explorers, they were recorders and guardians. Their job was to make the town visible without harming it. This is one of the central tensions in underwater archaeology. To study a site, you must enter it. To protect it, you must disturb it as little as possible. Every measurement, sample, and photograph must justify itself. Pavlopetri's shallow water makes it accessible, but accessibility is both a gift and a problem. It allows research and public fascination, yet it also exposes the site to careless contact. Still, the image of those divers moving over the ancient streets is hard to resist. A diver descends and modern noise falls away. The water changes every movement. Breathing becomes measured. The seabed comes closer. Then the stones appear, not as a pile, but as a pattern. The diver follows a line, marks a point, records a wall, then turns and sees another alignment crossing it. The town is read slowly, not from left to right, but from stone to stone. The work is quiet, methodical, and very far from the dramatic treasure-hunting stories that often crowd around underwater ruins. There is no need for treasure at Pavlopetri. The plan is the treasure. The fact that the streets can still be traced is the treasure. The chance to understand a prehistoric coastal settlement in its broader landscape is the treasure. Gold would almost be a distraction, though admittedly a very shiny one. What Pavlopetri offers is more useful than a chest of valuables. It offers structure. It shows how ordinary buildings, roads, tombs, craft activities and trade may have fitted together at a very early point in Aegean history. The rediscovery also changed how the public imagined the site. Pavlopetri became known through news reports, documentaries, and heritage campaigns. The phrase, "world's oldest submerged town," caught attention, as such phrases tend to do. It is a strong phrase, simple and memorable, but behind it is the slower work of evidence. The claim depends on mapping, dating, artifacts, architecture, and comparison with other submerged sites. Public fascination opened a door, and research had to walk through it, carrying the details carefully, preferably without tripping over the dramatic headline on the way in. The story of rediscovery also belongs to the history of underwater archaeology itself. For much of archaeology's early development, the sea was a barrier. Sites underwater were difficult to reach, difficult to record, and difficult to protect. Shipwrecks received attention, partly because they often contained cargo and dramatic stories of loss. Submerged settlements were more complicated. They required understanding not only artifacts but former landscapes. Pavlopetri helped show how modern underwater archaeology could study a town, not just a wreck. It offered a chance to record urban space underwater in 3 dimensions, with methods that could influence future work elsewhere. That is why the return to Pavlopetri in the 21st century mattered beyond one site. It demonstrated how collaboration between archaeologists, marine scientists, survey specialists, and Greek heritage authorities could turn a shallow submerged settlement into a detailed research project. The town itself was ancient, but the methods used to study it were modern. Old stones met new technology. Bronze Age streets met robotic survey equipment. It sounds almost unfair to the Bronze Age, but they did have better pottery, so perhaps the balance is acceptable. There is also something moving about the time gap between the town's use and its study. The people of Pavlopetri built in stone, clay, wood, fibre, and effort. Thousands of years later, divers arrived with measuring equipment, sonar, cameras, and laptops. The materials changed completely, but the central act remained human, people trying to make sense of a place. The Bronze Age inhabitants arranged the town for life. The archaeologists arranged data to understand that life. Both acts required order, attention, and patience. By following the stones, the divers did more than map a ruin. They restored the town to discussion. Pavlopetri could now be compared with other Aegean settlements. Its pottery could be studied in relation to trade. Its loom weights could be linked to textile production. Its tombs could be understood as part of a broader social landscape. Its submergence could be investigated through sea level and tectonic research. The site became active again, not as a town but as evidence. And the work did not make the site less mysterious. It made the mysteries better. Before proper study, the mystery was vague. There are ruins under the sea. After careful rediscovery, the questions became sharper. Why did the settlement grow when it did? How exactly did its economy function? Which parts of the town belonged to which periods? How did burial practices relate to households? How did changing coastlines affect its role? How much of the site remains covered by sand? What else might lie nearby? Good archaeology does not remove wonder, it replaces fog with better questions. The divers who followed the stones were not entering an empty place. They were entering the remains of movement, work, family, trade, and memory. Each wall they recorded had once shaped a human path. Each courtyard had once held light and labour. Each tomb had once held grief and care. The sea had made all of this quiet, but not meaningless. Rediscovery allowed those meanings to be approached again, carefully, and without pretending that every answer could be recovered. So Pavlopetri's modern story is not just a story of one discovery in 1967, or one survey in 1968, or one renewed project in 2009. It is a chain of attention stretched across more than a century. Phocion Negris noticed submerged remains in 1904. Nicholas Fleming confirmed the prehistoric town in 1967. The Cambridge team mapped it in 1968. Decades later, Galou, Henderson, Fleming, Spondylis, and their colleagues returned with modern methods to record, sample, and interpret it anew. The city did not change much between those visits. The ability to understand it did, and now, with the stones followed and the plan recognised, The next task was to see the town in more detail than hand tapes and sketches could allow. The question became not simply where the walls were, but how accurately they could be captured, modelled, and shared. Modern science was ready to bring Pavlopetri into a digital form, to map streets and structures through sonar, photogrammetry, and three-dimensional recording, giving the sunken town a new kind of visibility without lifting it from the seabed. By the time modern researchers returned to Pavlopetri with new equipment, the town had already been found, mapped, and named in archaeological discussion. But knowing that a site exists is only the beginning. A submerged town is not truly understood until it can be recorded in detail, measured accurately compared across seasons, and placed into a form that researchers can study without relying only on memory, sketches, and the heroic patience of divers with tape measures. Pavlopetri needed a new kind of map. Not just a drawing that said, here are some walls, here are some streets, and here is the sea doing its best to make everything slightly more difficult. It needed a detailed digital record of the town as it lay on the seabed. Mapping a town underwater is not like mapping a ruin on land. On land, an archaeologist can stand still, walk around, place equipment on stable ground, take notes, return to the same point, and look at a wall from different angles without having to think about air supply or waves. Underwater, every simple task becomes more complicated. A diver is floating. Light changes constantly. The surface moves. Sand can be stirred by a careless fin. A tape measure bends or drifts. Visibility can be good 1 hour and poor the next. Even shallow water, which sounds easy, can be awkward. It is close to the surface, so waves and surge can move a diver around, rather like trying to do careful paperwork on a bus that has just discovered potholes. This is why Pavlopetri became such an important test case for modern underwater mapping. The site is shallow, accessible, and large enough to be complex. It has streets, buildings, courtyards, graves, and tombs, but the remains are low and spread out across the seabed. It is not one shipwreck where the main object sits in a single patch. It is a whole town plan. That means the problem is not simply recording an artifact. The problem is recording relationships, where one wall sits in relation to another, how a street runs between buildings, where a courtyard opens, where tombs lie in relation to domestic space, where the ancient shoreline may have been. These details matter because they are the difference between looking at stones and understanding a settlement. The renewed Pavlopetri underwater archaeology project, beginning in 2009, brought together archaeologists, underwater specialists, marine scientists, and survey experts. The project worked with the Greek Effort of Underwater Antiquities and teams connected to the University of Nottingham, the Hellenic Centre for Marine Research, and other research partners. This kind of collaboration was necessary because no single type of expert could answer every question. Archaeologists could interpret buildings, pottery, and human activity. Marine geologists could study the seabed, shoreline, and processes of submergence. Survey specialists could capture accurate spatial data. Robotic researchers could help record large areas with visual and acoustic tools. Pavlopetri needed all of them, because a sunken city is part ruin, part landscape, part scientific problem, and part heritage site that still has to be protected from anchors, storms, and human curiosity with poor impulse control. One of the major goals was to digitally record the known remains. Earlier mapping had shown the basic plan, but modern recording could produce much more precise data. In 2009, the team used a shore-based robotic total station to take accurate three-dimensional points. A total station is a survey instrument that measures angles and distances. On land, it is commonly used for mapping buildings, trenches, landscapes, and excavation points. At Pavlopetri, the challenge was to connect that shore-based equipment with divers working in the water. Divers used a detail pole fitted with a prism and the total station recorded the location of points on the seabed. In practical terms, this meant a diver could place the pole on a wall corner or feature, and the instrument on shore could log its position with accuracy. That may sound simple when said quickly, but underwater it required careful coordination. The diver had to identify the feature, place the pole correctly, stay steady enough for a measurement, avoid disturbing the seabed, and then move to the next point. The team had to know which wall, corner or surface was being recorded. Each point had to be meaningful. Too few points, and the plan remains vague. Too many badly chosen points, and the data becomes cluttered without improving interpretation. Good mapping is not only about measuring, it is about knowing what is worth measuring. Alongside the total station work, the project used sector scanning sonar. Sonar is useful underwater because sound travels through water in ways that light often cannot. Cameras need clear visibility and good lighting. Sonar can help detect shape and structure even when the water is not perfectly clear. The sector scanning sonar sends out acoustic signals and records the returning echoes, creating an image of the surrounding seabed and features. For a site like Pavlopetri, this allowed researchers to scan low walls and structures that were difficult to record quickly by hand. The sonar was not there to replace the archaeologist's eye. It was there to add another way of seeing. This is an important point. Modern technology does not simply press a button and produce understanding. It produces data. The data must be checked, interpreted, compared, and questioned. A sonar image might show a line, but someone still has to ask whether that line is a wall, a natural feature, a modern disturbance, or a misleading echo. Technology can make the invisible more visible, but it does not remove the need for judgment. Archaeology has not yet reached the point where a machine looks at a stone and says, "Ah yes, domestic storage area, late afternoon complaints included." We still need humans for that. The combination of diver-recorded points and sonar survey allowed the team to improve the map of the town dramatically. They digitally recorded around 30,000 square metres of previously known buildings and discovered more than 9,000 square metres of additional structures in 2009. Among the newly identified features were a large rectangular hall and a street lined with buildings. That discovery matters because it showed that Pavlopetri was not only better preserved than many had imagined, but also larger and more complex than earlier mapping had captured. The hidden town still had more to show, even after decades of being known. This is one of the exciting parts of archaeological technology. It does not only make old information look cleaner, it can reveal new information. A better survey can show that what seemed like the edge of a site was not the edge at all. It can reveal walls partly hidden by sediment. It can connect features that had seemed separate. It can correct earlier plans, not because earlier researchers were careless, but because they were working with the tools available to them. The 1968 team gave the first serious plan of Pavlopetri. The modern team took that plan and pushed it into a much sharper form. Later work added even more advanced visual mapping. In 2011, the whole extent of the submerged site, around 8 hectares, was surveyed using a stereophotogrammetric, autonomous, underwater vehicle. That phrase is not exactly bedtime language, so let us take it slowly. Photogrammetry is a method of creating measurements and three-dimensional models from photographs. If you photograph an object or area from many overlapping angles, software can compare the images and calculate the shape of the surface. Stereophotogrammetry uses paired images, a little like two eyes seeing the same object from slightly different positions. An autonomous underwater vehicle, or AUV, is a robotic platform that can move through the water following a planned path while carrying cameras or sensors. At Pavlopetri, this meant the site could be recorded visually in a systematic way. Instead of relying only on individual photographs, the team could create a broader, connected photographic record. Images could be stitched together into mosaics and models, walls, streets, open areas, and artifact scatters could be placed into a detailed digital surface. The goal was a full photorealistic record and a complete three-dimensional model of the submerged town. In plain terms, the researchers wanted to build a digital version of Pavlopetri that preserved its layout and appearance as accurately as possible. This was not just for public display, though public display matters. A three-dimensional model lets researchers revisit the site digitally. They can measure features, compare areas, examine relationships, and share data with other scholars who may never dive there. It also creates a record of the site's condition at a particular time. That is important for preservation. If part of a wall is damaged later by an anchor or storm, earlier models can show what changed. Digital recording becomes a kind of insurance against loss. It cannot save the original stones by itself, but it can preserve information before damage occurs. The use of robotic systems at Pavlopetri also faced an unusual challenge. Many underwater robots are designed for deeper water, where there is more room to move and less interference from waves. Pavlopetri is shallow, in places less than 2 or 3 meters deep. That sounds friendly until you try to operate equipment there. Shallow water can be turbulent, waves can push the vehicle, the seabed is close, navigation must be precise. A robot cannot simply glide high above the site without losing detail, but it also cannot bump into ancient walls like an overexcited vacuum cleaner. The environment demanded special solutions. Researchers working on the robotic mapping developed lightweight platforms and diver-assisted systems suitable for shallow water. One approach involved a diver-held stereo sled, which allowed cameras to be moved across the site in a controlled way. Another involved small robotic platforms designed to work where larger vehicles would be impractical. This kind of engineering is not glamorous in the usual ancient history sense, but it is essential. The past does not always lie in places that suit our equipment. Sometimes the equipment must be redesigned because a Bronze Age town has decided to rest in inconveniently shallow water. The result of these efforts was the first high-resolution, three-dimensional visual mapping of a submerged ancient town at this scale. That achievement made Pavlopetri important not only as an archaeological site, but as a landmark in underwater recording methods. It showed what could be done when archaeology, robotics, and marine survey came together. Other submerged sites could benefit from similar methods. Pavlopetri became both a subject of study and a proving ground for techniques that could change how underwater heritage is documented elsewhere. But even the best model is not the town itself. This is worth remembering. A digital reconstruction can be beautiful, precise, and useful, but it is still a translation. It turns stone, sand, water, and light into data. It allows a researcher to zoom in, rotate, measure, and analyze. It allows a viewer to see the plan clearly without needing to swim over the site. But the original remains are still there, under the sea, exposed to real conditions. Technology can make Pavlopetri visible to more people, but protection still depends on choices made in the real bay. Modern mapping also helped researchers think about the ancient coastline. To understand Pavlopetri, it is not enough to map the walls. The surrounding seabed must be studied too. The town's original relationship to the shore is one of the keys to its history. If the town once stood on dry land near a protected anchorage, researchers need to know where the shoreline was, how the isthmus functioned, and when it became flooded. Marine geologists use tools such as swath bathymetry, side-scan sonar, and sub-bottom profiling to reconstruct the seabed and ancient coastal setting. These techniques help show the shape of the seafloor, identify buried or exposed features, and understand sediment layers beneath the surface. Swath bathymetry maps the depth and shape of the seabed across wide strips. Side-scan sonar creates images of the seabed texture and objects by sending sound pulses outward to either side. Sub-bottom profiling looks beneath the seabed surface, helping identify buried layers or structures. Together, these methods can show not only what sits on the seabed now, but how the landscape may have changed. For Pavlopetri, That matters because the town's submergence was part of a larger environmental story. The walls are only one part of the evidence. The seabed around them is the setting that explains why those walls ended up underwater. It is a little like trying to understand a house by looking only at the rooms and ignoring the street, the garden, the hill behind it, and the river slowly eating the back fence. You might describe the house well, but you would miss the reason everyone moved out. Pavlopetri requires both close and wide views. The close view shows walls, pottery, loom weights, and tombs. The wide view shows the changing coastline, the channel, the sea floor, and the forces that altered the town's future. Modern science also supported artifact study. The project sampled material across the site to understand its chronology and use. Pottery remained especially important. Ceramics helped confirm Mycenaean occupation and also pushed the site's occupation back to around 3500 BC. That date is one of the reasons Pavlopetri is described as more than 5,000 years old. The finds show that the town had a deep history, not just one short phase of use. Mapping the site and studying the artifacts together allowed researchers to connect space with time. A wall belongs somewhere. A pot belongs to a period. Put enough of those relationships together, and the town begins to gain a historical sequence. This is where digital mapping becomes more than a picture. It becomes a framework. If every artifact sample, wall line, grave, courtyard and street can be placed accurately, researchers can begin to ask where earlier material appears, where later activity is concentrated, whether certain parts of the town were used differently over time, and how expansion or contraction may have happened. A map is not just an illustration at the end of a report. It is a research tool. It holds the evidence in relationship. The public side of the mapping also mattered. Digital reconstruction allowed Pavlopetri to be shown to people who would never visit the site. A submerged town is difficult to present. You cannot easily walk visitors through it. You cannot put signs beside each wall and expect everyone to politely float in place while reading them. A three-dimensional model offers a way to share the site without requiring physical access. That is good for education, and it is also good for preservation. The more people can see and understand the importance of Pavlopetri without touching it, the better. There is a balance here. Public interest helps protect heritage by giving it value in the eyes of a wider audience. But too much uncontrolled attention can damage fragile sites. Pavlopetri is in shallow, clear water near a popular coast. That means it is easy to become curious about it in person. A digital model can satisfy some of that curiosity safely. It can show the layout, explain the science, and help people understand that the stones are not souvenirs, obstacles, or decorative pieces of seabed. They are archaeological evidence. The mapping also helped strengthen management arguments. When heritage authorities and researchers can show the exact extent and condition of a site, it becomes easier to plan protection. Which areas are most vulnerable? Where do boats pass? Where is anchoring a threat? Which parts of the site are exposed? Which are buried? Which features are rare or especially fragile? Without accurate maps, protection becomes vague. With accurate maps, it can become targeted. Pavlopetri's digital survey therefore had practical value beyond scholarship. It helped make the case that the town needed careful management. There is something fitting about using the newest tools to study one of the oldest known submerged towns. The people of Pavlopetri made their world with stone foundations, clay jars, looms, boats, and practical knowledge of the sea. Thousands of years later, researchers returned with sonar, robotic survey equipment, digital cameras, software, and computer models. Both groups were solving problems created by the same coast. The ancient people asked, how do we live here? The modern researchers asked, how do we record what remains here? Different questions, different tools, same place. And the tools did not make the work less human. That is important. Technology can sound cold when listed by name. Sonar, total station, AUV, photogrammetry, bathymetry, sub-bottom profiling. It can sound like the story has moved from ancient hands to machines. But behind each tool is a human decision. Where to survey? What resolution is needed? Which features to record? How to interpret a scan? How to check data against what divers see? How to protect the site while studying it? A machine can gather points, but it cannot feel the meaning of a street where people once walked. That part remains with the researchers and with us as listeners. The maps created from Pavlopetri also remind us that an underwater city is never seen all at once in the water. A diver sees part of a wall, then another part, then a room, then a street. The complete plan exists in the assembled record. It is the map that lets the mind rise above the seabed and see the town as a whole. Without mapping, Pavlopetri is experienced in fragments. With mapping, the fragments become a settlement. That is one of the gifts of modern science. It gives the eye a height it does not physically have, yet the sea keeps its influence even in the data. Underwater photographs are affected by light, turbidity, angle, and colour loss. Sonar images need interpretation. Sediment hides some features. Marine growth covers others. The model is detailed, but it is still shaped by conditions in the water. Science improves the view, but it does not remove the sea from the process. Pavlopetri is not a tidy laboratory object. It is a real place in a moving environment. That moving environment is why repeated recording may matter in the future. A digital model from 1 year can be compared with the later surveys. Has a wall shifted? Has sediment covered a street? Has erosion exposed new material? Has damage occurred from anchors or storms? Underwater sites change, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. Monitoring is part of preservation. Pavlopetri has already survived thousands of years, but that does not mean it will automatically survive modern pressures. Old things can be surprisingly delicate, especially when speedboats, tourism, and neglect join the conversation. The mapping of Pavlopetri also changed how researchers could talk about submerged prehistory more generally. For many people, underwater archaeology meant shipwrecks. Ships sink quickly, often with cargo, creating dramatic time capsules. Submerged settlements are different. They are not a single event. They are landscapes that changed. They require archaeologists to think about sea level rise, tectonics, settlement planning, economy, and long-term human adaptation. Pavlopetri helped show that underwater archaeology could study towns, not only wrecks. It could reveal prehistoric urban planning, coastal economies, and environmental change. This is one reason the site has such a strong pull on the imagination. It is not just a ruin underwater. It is a place where modern science lets us see a lost coastline. The map does more than outline buildings. It brings back a former relationship between land and sea. When researchers model Pavlopetri, they are not only drawing walls, they are helping us imagine dry streets where there is now water, a working shore where there is now seabed, and a human settlement where the modern swimmer sees only stones. Still, the most powerful result of all this technology may be very simple. It confirms that Pavlopetri was real in a concrete, measurable way. The streets are not guesswork. The buildings are not fantasy. The courtyards, tombs, and walls can be placed, mapped, and studied. Modern science does not make the site magical. It makes it clearer, and clarity can be more moving than exaggeration. A real Bronze Age street beneath shallow water is more interesting than any invented legend, because real people walked there. So when we picture the modern mapping of Pavlopetri, we can picture several layers at once. A diver placing a pole on a stone wall, a sonar scan turning echoes into shape, a robotic platform moving carefully above the seabed, a camera taking overlapping images, a computer stitching photographs into a model, a marine scientist studying the seabed around the town, an archaeologist comparing pottery with the mapped buildings, a heritage manager thinking about how to protect the site. Each action adds another layer of understanding, and under all of it, the town remains where it has been for thousands of years. Low walls under clear water, streets without footsteps, courtyards without work, tombs without visitors. The science does not wake the city exactly, it records it. It gives us a way to see it without disturbing it too much. It lets the town be studied while still resting in place. From here, the story begins to slow again, because after all the measuring, scanning, modelling and recording, Pavlopetri leaves us with a quieter question. What do we do with a place like this once we can see it clearly? We can map it, date it, model it, and explain it. But the town still belongs to a fragile coast and a living sea. Its final importance is not only in what it teaches about the Bronze Age, but in what it asks from the present: care, restraint, and the ability to look at a shallow patch of water and understand that a whole human world once stood there. And so, after following the stones through shallow blue water, after looking at streets, courtyards, graves, storage jars, loom weights, boats, coastlines, earthquakes, and careful modern mapping, we come back to the quiet fact at the centre of Pavlopetri. It was a real town, not a legend, not a fantasy, not an underwater palace invented to make the past feel more dramatic. A real place, built by real people, used for real work and then changed by time, water, and the movements of the earth. That may be the strongest part of its story. Pavlopetri does not need to shout. It does not need gold rooms, giant statues, hidden kings, or a curse written in a language no one can read. It gives us something smaller and more useful. It gives us the outline of ordinary life: a street where people walked, a courtyard where people worked, a room where goods were stored, a tomb where someone was placed with care, a settlement by the shore where families lived close to the sea and took part in the wider life of the Aegean. There is something steadying about that. The past can feel very distant when we speak about it in dates and periods. Final Neolithic, Early Bronze Age, Mycenaean, 3rd millennium BC, 2nd millennium BC. Useful terms, of course, and very helpful if you're trying to keep archaeologists from gently correcting you over dinner. But those labels can also make the people disappear. Pavlopetri helps bring them back, not as named individuals because their names are lost, but as people with tasks, habits, worries, and places to be. Someone once knew those streets without needing to think. Someone knew which doorway led home. Someone knew where the good storage jars were kept. Someone knew which neighbour had borrowed a tool and had still not returned it, proving that some human traditions are older than we would like to admit. Someone looked toward the water and judged the wind. Someone worked thread on a loom. Someone carried food. Someone prepared a burial. Someone watched a boat arrive and wondered what it had brought. The town beneath the sea is made powerful by those ordinary possibilities. We cannot prove every small scene, and we should not pretend that we can. Archaeology is not a machine for inventing perfect stories. It is a careful way of building understanding from evidence. But the evidence at Pavlopetri points again and again toward a working community. Buildings, streets, courtyards, graves, pottery, storage, transport containers, loom weights, a coastal position, a connection to trade, a long history of occupation. These are not vague hints, they are the remains of organised life, and now that life rests beneath the water, not deep under crushing darkness, not beyond the reach of sunlight. Pavlopetri lies in shallow water, close to the shore, where the surface still moves above the stones. That makes it feel strangely close. A swimmer might pass above part of the old town. A small fish might turn where a wall once divided one space from another. Sand may cover a street and uncover it again. Sunlight may shift across a stone that has been in place since long before the famous cities of classical Greece rose to power. It is a strange kind of nearness. The town is close enough to see, but too far away to fully recover. The stones remain, but the voices are gone. The layout remains, but the daily meanings have mostly faded. We can map the walls, but we cannot ask the people why they placed a room exactly there, or what they argued about in the courtyard, or whether a certain boat was late so often that everyone expected it. The past is generous at Pavlopetri, but it is not complete. Maybe that incompleteness is part of what makes the site feel so human. Every life leaves partial traces. Even our own lives, surrounded by photographs, messages, receipts, calendars, passwords, and far too many files named final version, would still be difficult for someone to fully understand after thousands of years. They might know where we lived, what we bought, what we built, and what we threw away. But would they know how an ordinary afternoon felt? Would they know which chair was someone's favourite? Would they know the voice of a parent calling from another room, or the feeling of waiting for news, or the small comfort of returning home at the end of a long day? Pavlopetri reminds us that archaeology can come close to those things, but never completely hold them. It can show us the frame of life. It can show us the tools, the spaces, the burials, the trade, and the changes in the land. It can help us imagine responsibly. But the full experience of the town belonged to the people who lived there, and they carried much of it away with them when their lives ended. Still, what remains is enough to matter. The streets matter because they show repeated movement. The courtyards matter because they show work and household space. The tombs matter because they show care for the dead. The pottery matters because it shows storage, cooking, trade, and contact. The loom weights matter because they point to textile production, to patient work done by skilled hands. The shoreline matters because it explains why people chose the place, and why the place eventually became vulnerable. The sea matters because it was both road and danger, both provider and final cover. The town also matters because it changes how we think about the ancient coast. Pavlopetri shows that some of the most important prehistoric landscapes are not only buried under soil, some are underwater. Around the world, coastlines have shifted since people first settled near them. Sea levels have changed. Land has risen and fallen, rivers have moved, storms have reshaped shorelines. Places where people once lived, traded, cooked, buried their dead, and watched their children grow may now be offshore, hidden under sand, silt, coral, or shallow waves. Pavlopetri is not only one site, it is a reminder that the map of the human past is larger than the dry land we can easily walk on. That is why underwater archaeology matters so much. It asks us to look where history is harder to reach. It asks us to think about former landscapes, not only present ones. It asks divers, archaeologists, geologists, engineers, conservators, and local communities to work together. It asks for patience, because the sea does not make documentation simple. It asks for restraint because taking an object from the seabed can damage the story it belongs to. And it asks for protection, because ancient sites can survive for thousands of years and still be harmed quickly by a careless anchor or a souvenir hunter with poor manners and very little imagination. Pavlopetri is fragile. That may seem odd to say about a town that has lasted for more than 5,000 years, but age and strength are not the same thing. A stone wall can be ancient and vulnerable at the same time. A site can survive earthquakes, submergence, storms, and centuries of obscurity, then be damaged by modern boating, pollution, looting, or simple neglect. The town has already endured a great deal. It does not need us to test its patience further. So one of the things Pavlopetri still teaches is care. Not the dramatic kind of care that arrives with speeches and spotlights, but practical care, marking protected areas, managing boats, educating visitors, recording the site properly, supporting local heritage work, respecting that a small piece of pottery on the seabed is not a keepsake, but part of a larger pattern, leaving things where they are, understanding that curiosity does not give us the right to take. That is a lesson worth keeping, especially in a world where so many places are visited, photographed, posted, and sometimes damaged before anyone has properly understood them. The best way to honour a place like Pavlopetri is not to turn it into a fantasy. It is to let it remain real. real stones, real evidence, real uncertainty, real people behind it. That is more interesting than exaggeration. The town does not need to be Atlantis. It does not need a secret doorway or a hidden treasure chamber. The treasure is that an early town plan survives beneath the water. The treasure is that we can still trace human organisation from thousands of years ago. The treasure is that ordinary life, which usually vanishes almost completely, left enough of itself behind to be studied. And there is comfort in that too. Ordinary life may feel temporary while we are inside it. We wash dishes, answer messages, look for keys, make food, forget something, remember something, worry about tomorrow and wonder where the day went. It can all seem too small to last. But Pavlopetri shows that ordinary life can leave deep marks, not always in the form of names or stories, but in arrangements. A wall placed here, a street used there, a grave cut into the ground, a jar left broken, a weight from a loom. The repeated actions of daily life become the evidence by which future people understand a world. The people of Pavlopetri did not know they were leaving evidence for us. They were not building for a documentary. They were not setting their town down as a message in a bottle. They were doing what people do, making a place useful, making a home, making goods, making decisions, making mistakes probably, because even the Bronze Age was not free of human error. They lived close to the sea because it gave them opportunities. They stayed while the town worked. Then, when conditions changed, they or their descendants left, and the water slowly took the streets. And now the sea moves over the town every day. It does not explain itself. It does not apologize. It simply moves. The water that once carried boats above or near Pavlopetri now covers the walls that framed its rooms. It shifts sand over the town and away from it. It lets light fall across the stones in broken patterns. It allows the ruins to be seen, then softened, then seen again. In that sense, Pavlopetri is not frozen. It is still in an active setting. The ancient town is no longer inhabited, but it is not sealed away from the world. It remains part of the coast, part of the bay, part of the living sea. This makes the site feel different from ruins on land. A land ruin often seems to sit in place, weathering slowly under the sky. An underwater ruin is touched constantly. The water moves over it, around it, through it. The site has a daily life of currents, sediment, fish, light, and human visitors. It is quiet, but not still. The sea has become the town's new atmosphere. That is why, when we think of Pavlopetri, it may be best not to picture a drowned city in a single moment of disaster. Picture instead a long sequence. First, a shore that made settlement possible. Then a town growing, working, trading, burying its dead and using the sea. Then change. A shoreline shifting, land sinking, water rising, networks weakening, people adapting, people leaving, walls collapsing, the sea entering. Sand gathering, memory fading, stones remaining, a geologist noticing, a diver following a line, a team measuring walls, modern science building a digital map, a listener somewhere far away imagining the streets underwater before sleep. That long sequence is the real story. Not one moment, but many. Not one cause, but several. Not one mystery, but a set of human and natural processes that together carried a living town into the seabed. And perhaps that is why Pavlopetri feels so fitting for a quiet night. It slows us down. It asks us to think in longer measures. Not minutes, not deadlines, not the small impatience of a loading screen that refuses to behave, but centuries, coastlines, settlements, and the patient movement of water. It reminds us that human life is brief, but human traces can be persistent. It reminds us that places change even when people believe they are permanent. It reminds us that the sea can be useful, beautiful, dangerous, and patient all at once. If you were standing near Pavlopetri today, looking into the clear water, you might not immediately see a city. You might see ripples, sand, rock, patches of seagrass, a few lines that seem almost too straight. Then, slowly, your eye might adjust. A wall, another wall, a corner, a route between them, the faint shape of planning beneath the surface. That is often how understanding works. Not all at once. First, scattered details, then pattern, then meaning. And in that meaning the people return a little. Not fully, never fully, but enough. Enough to remember that they were not symbols. Enough to remember that they lived in the present tense of their own time. Enough to remember that the town beneath the water was once warm with voices, tasks, storage, work, trade, mourning, and routine. Enough to look at the sea and understand that it is covering more than stones. So as we close this gentle journey, let the image settle quietly. A shallow bay in southern Greece. Clear water moving over old foundations, a street that no one walks anymore. A courtyard that once held work and light. Tombs that kept the dead close to the living. Jars that once held food or goods. Loom weights that once helped turn fibre into cloth. A town that began as a practical place by the shore and became one of the most remarkable submerged archaeological sites in the world. And here you are, much later in time, listening from your own small corner of the world. Perhaps you're near the sea, perhaps you're far from it. Perhaps it is late where you are, and the room around you is quiet. Perhaps by now, Pavlopetri has become less like a distant ruin and more like a place you can almost picture. Not perfectly, not with false certainty, but enough to see the stones beneath the water and understand that they once held a town together. Before you drift away, I will ask you gently what I asked at the beginning. Where are you listening from tonight? Are you near a coast, a river, a lake, or only the small inland sea of blankets that gathers around the end of a long day? And if you could hover above Pavlopetri for just a moment, looking down through the clear Aegean water, what part of the old town would your eye search for first? A street, a doorway, a courtyard, a tomb, or the place where the shore once met the lives of the people who built there? If this journey brought you a little calm, or gave you a quiet place to rest your thoughts, I would be very grateful if you liked the video and subscribed. It helps Life Beyond Seen continue making these slow journeys through science, history, and the old places that still have something to teach us. And if someone you know enjoys ancient mysteries without needing them covered in lightning, curses, or a man shouting over dramatic music, perhaps share this with them too. Pavlopetri has rested beneath the sea for thousands of years. It does not hurry. It does not need to. As its streets remain in the shallows, patient and low, while the water passes above them again and again. The people who lived there are gone, but the shape of their town is still with us. And that is enough for tonight. So breathe slowly. Let the image of the clear water fade gently in your mind. Let the old stones stay where they are under the blue, held by sand, light, and time. Sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever you are, and may your own night be calm, sheltered, and undisturbed by anything more serious than the thought of a Bronze Age jar being carried very carefully down a street that now belongs to the sea.